Can we do a roll call for?
Here?
Here.
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 Hernandez.
Here.
Here. So we will start off. Oh, you had a statement.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry.
If I may, I'd like to start off with a quick thank you to the staff of District 65. This week, we are celebrating Teacher and Staff Appreciation Week. During the first week of May, schools around the country recognize and honor the outstanding work of educators as part of Teacher Appreciation Week. This year's national theme is Out of This World. In District 65, we recognize that the ability our teachers have to change the lives of children across Evanston and Skokie, and that their work and impact extends far beyond the classroom. They help to inspire a lifelong love of learning and work tirelessly to make a difference academically and help to enhance students' overall social and emotional well-being. Our team of educators is incredible, and yet they can't do it alone. For that reason, we take this week to celebrate every member of our team, from our dedicated secretaries to our social workers, to our custodians, to our health clerks, school leadership, and every single person in between. We are very grateful for their service to our students and to our families. They go above and beyond, oftentimes working around the clock to ensure that operations run smoothly and that our schools are safe, welcoming places for all. I encourage each of you to take a few moments this week to thank a member of our team. Give them a smile and a thank you. Send a quick email or give a high five for District 65. Small gestures go a long way in showing someone that they are appreciated. On behalf of my leadership team and on behalf of the Board of Education, I would like to thank our nearly 1,500 staff members for all that they do each and every day for the students and families of District 65. From the bottom of our hearts, we thank you. And thank you.
Thank you for that tribute, and thank you to all educators and staff in the district this week and every week. Hopefully you're being appropriately showered with gratitude this week. Adila, do we have any? Okay, so we will move on to public comments. Members of the public are welcome and invited to address the Board of Education during open public meetings. Speakers are discouraged from using the public comment period to air concerns about or voice personal attacks against specific district employees, being mindful that the public comment period is not a suitable forum for fact-finding or resolution of disputes. Rather, we strongly encourage members of the public who have concerns about specific district employees to communicate with us following district communication guidelines available in our student handbook. Please remember to state your name and that you have 3 minutes to address the board. Our first speaker will be Rachel. Do you want to sit up here in front of the microphone?
Like I said?
Yeah. Yes, please.
All right.
And if you would move the microphone a little closer. Thank you.
All right. My name is Dr. Rachel Coleman, and I have 2 children at Oakton Elementary School. They're both in the ACC program. I received my PhD in U.S. history from Indiana University, and through that work I had a great understanding of the way that much of our education system is still very centered on whiteness and very centered on settler colonial societies and Western civilization and Western values. And so when I moved here 3 years ago with my children, I absolutely jumped at the chance to put them in the ACC program. I should note that my children are both white. They are currently the only white children in the ACC program, but what I want to communicate here is that what ACC provides is something that is positive for every student, regardless of their race. And I would love to see the ACC program expanded or other ways integrated into other aspects of District 65. So I want to talk a little bit about our experience with ACC. When the Colin Kaepernick issue came up a couple years ago, my daughter heard something on NPR about it. And she asked what it was. So I briefly broke down what was going on, the kneeling in the NFL, and she goes, oh, just like Muhammad Ali. She already had this cultural knowledge and framework for understanding a protest like that, I almost hadn't connected all those dots myself. I felt she was so quick on the ball. And then my 6-year-old the other day heard something on the radio of John F. Kennedy, and he goes, oh, that's the person who passed, desegregation of the schools and made it so black people could vote. And clearly he had learned about the Civil Rights Act, he'd learned about Kennedy's legacy, and things that your average 6-year-old probably doesn't know. So they've got all of these pieces of knowledge. What's interesting to me is that TWE is so very sought after in our community, but in ACC, it doesn't have the same draw or the same name recognition. And I understand that learning Spanish is, learning another language, very important. But there's a cultural literacy that students learn in ACC that is just as valuable, especially as we move towards a society where white people are going to become a minority in the country. It is, today, over 50% of babies being born are not white. Our children need to have the ability to get outside of this sort of white settler colonial perspective and to understand various value systems, various cultural backgrounds, and ACC provides that. And it's not just like little tidbits of history, it's also values. So for example, the principles of Kwanzaa are something that they study. And Ujima is collective work and responsibility. The amount of time my kids spent learning about that last fall in preparation for the Kwanzaa ceremony, which focused on that, I found that fascinating because there's this, there's sort of white capitalist values that we assume are universal that really in our society as a whole, in our world as a whole, are not. And a program like ACC teaches kids that there's more than one way to look at something that they don't really get in other places. So I wanted to present that perspective that it's not just something that's relevant for just one population, and it's something we really should strive to expand and present to all of our students. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Oh, and the teachers in the program are absolutely amazing. It's like a family, the community there. I actually had the 5th grade teacher over at my house the other day because her daughter is best friends with mine, and she talked my daughter down from a tantrum, and I'm just like, I am so glad she's gonna be her teacher next year. Like, they look after those kids, those are their kids too. I love that.
Thank you. Kareem Wilson.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
So I just have to say that this is my first time at anything of this nature. This is very official for me, so thank you for your time and thank you for having me. To piggyback pretty much on what Rachel Coleman was just speaking about, my name is Kareem Wilson. I have a son who is in the ACC program at Oakton. He's a 1st grader. This is his 2nd year in the program. He started in kindergarten. So prior to moving to Evanston, I am a Southsider, proud Southsider. So there was some anxiety moving to the North Shore. Very anxious, did not want to become a suburban dad. No offense to any suburban dad, I just did not want to be a suburban dad. I didn't want to go to soccer games. I didn't want to do any of that. Part of the pitch for me in looking for a school for my son was I wanted to give him, as a parent, you want to provide something better for your children, but the thing that I also wanted was to give him something that I had, a sense of pride in who he is and what he looks like. A sense of pride in where he comes from and the heritage and the ancestry in which he comes from. And when my wife then slid the laptop, because I was like, whoa, I guess we gotta go to Oakton since we just moved up here. And again, nervous about it. I don't know if I can give him that. She slid the laptop over after she was doing some research, and I saw the ACC program, and I lit up. I was excited to send my son to Oakton because of this ACC program, because I had found a place where my son would get what I got. And what I got in school and at home in tandem was a confidence in being who I am, proud to be who I am, proud to be an African American, proud to know where I come from, proud to understand that we move culture, right? And one of the many things that I love that he has understood that I didn't really have to teach him, he just saw me doing it, but he gets it at school, is this collective effort. It's about all of us and not just about me only. And that's why I think the ACC program is vitally important, not just to our children, but to all kids, all children, right? Because that's the thing that we miss in this society, that there is a collective effort and a collective responsibility that one should not be without if I have. If I understand, if I can help you understand, then I should be working they sit at tables and they help one another get along in work. And that makes me proud to see that he understands that it is not just about him, it is about all of us. Thank you very much for your time. I hear the wrap it up button.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will move on. We have one item for approval, the Bessie Rhodes 8th grade field trip. Sergio, you want to do the motion?
I move that the Board of Education approve the Bessie Rhodes 8th grade field trip as presented.
Second.
Do we have any comments or questions?
Have an awesome time.
All right, absolutely, agreed. And just, this is a annual field trip that Bessie Rhodes 8th graders take to Springfield, Illinois, and St. Louis, Missouri. So, all right, with that, we can do the vote.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yes. All right, then we have a few discussion items tonight. Our first one is a restorative practices update and reflection. Joyce?
Yeah. Hi, thank you. Tonight we're going to talk a little bit about our restorative practices that we have going on within the district. We have our two restorative practices facilitators, Teresa Quinn and Megan Navarra, who are here today, who are going to provide us a PowerPoint that's going to give us some information about the restorative practices, talk a little bit about what we have been doing this year, and talk about what we see as our plans for next year. We have been doing restorative practices within the district for about 3.5, 4 years now, which began kind of at the same point in time when we were looking at SB 100 that addressed changes in our in discipline, as well as our strategic plan beginning. All of our schools have been trained in restorative practices at this point, but we really are emphasized this year on our middle schools and doing our work there. So I don't know if you guys want to come up and share with us some info. Thank you. Yes, right over here. Go over here.
It actually, if you want to sit at the table, you're more than welcome. We can sit it, and if you want to sit down here, you can actually see the slides. Yeah, I'll pour one and one.
Yes, thank you.
All right, hello, everybody. Thanks for having us. We've been working really hard this year. We're excited to share some of what we've done with you and some of our philosophy as well. So, I know a lot of you have some basic premise of what restorative practices are, but for me, we need to go backwards to really fully understand it and redefine it and talk about the foundational philosophy of what it means. So restorative practices are not an intervention, but it's rather a shift in a way of thinking about changing school culture to call students in with accountability, high control, high accountability versus pushing them out. So this is a paradigm shift that takes time. But when they're implemented, and when they're implemented well and with fidelity, we have the power to make schools safer, increase achievement, improve climate, empower students to solve problems in a nonviolent way, and to change lives.
So this framework just kind of gives you basically all the steps in terms of what restorative practices looks like. So even though 65 kind of adopted it to really address discipline and the racial disparities, restorative practices does so much more than that. And so when you look at the chart at the very top, it says proactive sharing circles. So that's a lot of where our work has been so far, and that's about 80% of what happens in a building. So if in a building you are doing it with Fidelity, all your teachers are doing proactive sharing circles to some degree, and they're doing it about 80% of the time, right? So that's building community in their classrooms, building relationships, which then ultimately leads to how they choose to discipline and kind of eliminates that bias or that racial disparity that we're seeing.
And those circles can look like social emotional, they can be curriculum based, they can be issues that have come up in the classroom or throughout the school.
And then the restorative conversations and informal restorative conferences, that's also a part of your 80%. So that's when either something is happening in the room with a particular student or a small group of students, you would have what we would call a restorative conversation. So essentially when a teacher typically pulls a student to the side or out in the hallway really quickly, there's a restorative format as to how they have that conversation. So they're not winging it. There are very specific questions in what they ask them in terms of what's happening or what's going on. What were you thinking or what are you feeling right now? What's the impact it's either having on them or others? And then how are they going to come back in the room and repair the harm is really the 4 essential things you want to hit with that particular student. And so there's some ownership taking, there's some repairing of the harm, and there's some self-awareness of what was I thinking, how am I feeling, why am I doing what I'm doing or responding the way I'm responding. And then the lower half, the responsive circles and formal peace circles, those are for more, those are things that are happening more 20% of the time, so it's taking less time. So the responsive circles are really when something's going on in the classroom or large group and you're responding to an issue or a concern versus being reactive to it. And then your formal peace circles are what we typically call restorative conferences. So if there is a major issue where there is some harm caused and it has gotten down to administration, they could technically refer that situation to a restorative conference, and all parties would have to agree to basically sit in a circle, and there's a format to that as well in terms of how you address an issue.
And the restorative conversations are what is the backbone of our restorative practices. They run through everything. And one thing we've been working on is getting teachers to do pull-asides with kids throughout the classroom, but they also are what we do when we do informal conferences. So we do those in the offices in conjunction with APs and principals. We do them as we coach teachers how to do it, or just trying to calm a child down in the hall. In that relationship repairing is the key to all of this. So there's been harm done either between two people or to the community, and so that's where the accountability piece comes in. It's the moving away of shame and bringing someone back into the community.
So this is punitive versus restorative discipline. So a lot of restorative practices is really about the language you use, affective statements, building the community, building a culture in your building. The discipline is really the secondary piece of it, but there is a way to do discipline that is restorative versus punitive, which is the traditional style we've learned to do in America since forever. And so really restorative discipline ensures a supportive and stable educational environment while encouraging growth towards self-discipline, self-awareness, accepting responsibility, and appreciating the rights of others. And when fully implemented with a race-conscious lens, RB can reduce racial disparities in school discipline. And so at the bottom, you kind of see the continuum. So there's the proactive work that you do. And then, So this year we worked on building a behavioral continuum for teachers and admin to use when they use discipline, so that it is looking through that restorative lens. So at the very bottom, we listed what are some proactive things you should be doing and could be doing in your room. Then how are you being responsive? What are some instructive measures that you can do? We did blend some PBIS into that continuum. And then intensive or admin, what happens when it does happen to get to the admin level? Because there are things that will get to the admin level. And then what's the family and community component in terms of RP and how they blend into the school? Because that's a major piece of it as well. And then the next one.
Okay, so we wanted to clear this up a little bit too, because I think there's some misconceptions about what this is and what this isn't. So this idea that restorative practices will eliminate misbehavior throughout the school. So the reality is, if there were a magic bullet, it would be magic, right? There's nothing that works 100% of the time for 100% of the people. But when implemented properly, it becomes the dominant culture of the building. And I used to work at Kingsley, and I can tell you that that was a school where that was the dominant culture. It was a culture of respect. It's how people just talked to each other and interacted with parents and male men who came in the building, male people. And so when that's the dominant culture, it reduces the discipline issues in the building. Restorative practices will be successful with every student. My children go to District 65, and I work with a bunch of kids on my son's sports teams, and so they get lots of feedback how they feel about my circles. And there's lots of, I love it. Oh, I have to talk about my feelings, and so I don't love your mom's circles. And so, there's some kids love it, some kids don't. Sometimes it's fantastic. Sometimes it's not what a kid would prefer to be doing. But overall, I think it's, we attempt it with every student, and there's lots of other supports that can be used in addition to it. Go ahead, Quinn.
One big one is RPs will work immediately and every time, and the reality is that it is a social skill building strategy, and it takes time and practice. And so when I tried to work with some teachers on helping them with restorative conversation, they'll be like, oh, it totally didn't work, or the kid refused to talk or whatever. And that's gonna be the case because kids aren't used to having to talk about, one, what was going on and what they were thinking and feeling, and then having to really address how they were impacting others and what they're going to do to repair the harm. It's really about, you're constantly disrupting the group, and you need to stop talking, and you got to do this, and I need you to go back in there and get to work and focus, right? The teacher is owning the conversation where we're trying to teach kids to own the conversation, and that's not something kids are used to doing. And so they can learn that through restorative conversations as well as circles. But if you're using RP with fidelity, you're making them use that language all the time. And so that does take a lot of time. And then all RPs are only used to address student misbehavior and conflict. And again, it's not only used to do misbehavior is the reality. It should be used to address any conflict or any situation. Again, it's a culture.
And it should be proactive. The majority of it should be proactive. So that's our circles. Our classroom sharing circles. So this one is famous too. Restorative practices are too soft, there are no consequences, and that no one is held accountable. If you've ever when I've been in restorative conferences with students who have to look across the table at the person that they did something to and truly apologize, that's a huge consequence. And I had one of the APs I was working with say the other day, she said, when an adult was complaining that the punishment wasn't punitive enough, she said, was it what the child needs, or is that what you need? Because I'm interested in what the child needs. And that doesn't mean that there's not other natural consequences that don't come with it. If you start a food fight, you can go apologize to the custodian and then go help clean the cafeteria, that type of thing. But it's about the accountability. It's about owning what you did wrong and making it right. And then you do the last one.
RPs are just the RP personnel's responsibility, which is the myth. And the reality is creating and sustaining restorative culture requires active participation from all educators in the building. And so that technically means everyone from your secretarial staff to your custodial staff to teaching staff. Everybody has a core understanding of restorative practices, has a core use of the language, and then depending on what your role is in the building, you'll take that further in terms of if you actually facilitate circles or you do this. But at the very base, everybody understands the language and how they interact and talk with kids and the real core understanding of what RP is. And so the reality is everybody has to be a part of the process.
Which is what has to happen if a culture shifts, right? So that's what we were talking about, when you walk in a building and you feel, everybody, if you've been in different buildings, they all have different feelings. And so that's that dominant culture that's hard to capture. But I think if everybody is fully engaged in this, that's what it feels like. Okay, so this is kind of what we've been doing this year.
So one, we provided one-to-one coaching with teachers on proactive classroom sharing circles. So a lot of teachers, especially the middle school, like Ms. Bart said, we focused on the middle schools. And so different schools were in different spaces in terms of how much exposure they had to circles or restorative practices. So that's been one of the bigger pieces, is just getting them to understand why you do circles, how it builds community relationship, and really just how to do it and use it effectively in their classroom settings.
And we have been, that has been a huge time chunk, because we do a 8 to 10 week training session with these teachers with the gradual release. And we're trying to show them all the different ways they can use it so they can own it. So when we went to go see The Hate U Give, we spent 4 weeks training teachers on how to create safe and trusting spaces with the sharing circle. So when we went to go see The Hate U Give, we come back, we circle up, we have a safe space to talk about police brutality and that kind of thing.
Facilitate responsive circles. So again, that has either been in the classroom or has been small group pullout. With either, well, no, we got formal later. So that's when issues arise or conflicts arise, and you can circle up and talk about the issue and address it as a community versus the teacher trying to address it with a small group of students or whatever. If it's happening in the classroom and it's affecting everyone, then we circle up and do that. So we've been doing some of that. And then the next one is restorative conferences, and formal and informal. So again, that's where you're sitting as a circle, and that could be where it's pulled out. So it's been something has come down to admin, or something is happening where there's just a lot of back and forth between some students that are escalating to a potential fight or what have you. We pre-conference with them and sit down, and then we have this formal conference with them to address the issue, where they go through the same process and then they create their own agreement. You don't tell them what they have to do. They create their own agreement. And
I think this has been really effective this year for us. We've been, because one of the things that we've been working on is reframing this idea of school as a place where nothing bad ever happens, and instead of thinking of it as, one of my colleagues described it as a town square where all these souls converge, and the idea that there wouldn't be conflict is naive, and that our job as adults is to help them navigate that conflict. So these informal conferences have been very productive in terms of being explicit with students about what they need, what we expect, how we can forge a compromise on that. And then are we going to repair the harm and be friends? No? Okay, then we're going to make a contract on how we're going to behave safely and respectfully, not friends. So those happen all the time, and those have been really effective.
So we've consulted on implementation of RPs with school administration and staff. So again, that's just kind of the basic work of what work we need to do and what we're doing in the school buildings, and consulting with teachers on help that they need, consulting with administrators when they're stuck and they're like, okay, how do I go about this restoratively? And just really having those conversations and helping them kind of grasp the concept and really how to learn how to do the process and build that culture in the buildings. And then engage in restorative conversations with students and lunchtime conferences with teachers and students, with families. Again, so that's just the teaching of restorative conversations, utilizing those restorative conversations, having them with parents. So there's an approach and a way in terms of every time you interact with someone, how you're going about that. You want to take the next one?
Yep, we've done some staff meetings, we've done grade level meetings with trainings, and then we did half-day professional development on formal restorative conferencing with middle school admin, psychs, and social workers. And then we've provided consultation to classroom teachers on building relationships with students in the form of all sorts of things, effective statements and behavior contracts and pull-out conversations that we facilitated. And then we're both leading each, I'm at one, you're at?
I'm at Shoot.
You're doing it at Shoot and I'm doing it at King Arts. We're doing a peer mediation class that is fantastic in terms of just teaching children and helping them work with us on conflict resolution and moving towards the goal of peer mediation probably by next year.
Right. So instead of us always facilitating the restorative conversation, essentially the students are learning how to do it for themselves. So the idea is when something comes to admin, they would assess if it's appropriate to transfer or to refer to peer mediation. And then those students have been well-trained and they host the mediation themselves, because you also want kids to take ownership in doing some of these things. Like they can facilitate circles as well at some point. They can do the restorative conversations. They can kind of just take it on where teachers aren't always having to do it or staff aren't always having to do it. The kids will just automatically do it.
And that ownership makes them that much better at all of this. What'd I do?
I think you, yeah, okay.
Next year.
Go ahead.
Okay, so we are building our long-term plan, and that is, we have it scaled out to 3 years. And, you know, the standard for this is 3 to 5 for most restorative practices, and we've built it out for how to spread us out and not be too thin. So in trying to do that, we listed our benchmarks and then sort of some protocol for how we could possibly do that. So our benchmarks include that school-wide understanding of what restorative practices are and what the purpose of them are, so that every administrator is able to explain why we do this, how it affects students, how it contrasts with punitive consequences, that type of thing. And then another huge one is establishing those foundational structures for restorative practices. So that could look like, we've been proposing having we're calling it, for the moment, this is a temporary name, restorative in-school suspension. So the idea that there would be a room where students could go to repair harm, to calm down, to repair harm that had been done, to have conferences facilitated, to do some social emotional work, maybe some yoga, get their schoolwork done, and then return to class. So it's like one foundational structure that we could implement. And also trainings, right?
So utilize a process to collect and analyze data. We all know that is hugely important. It's one of our benchmarks. And that's to collect data on all things that are going on restorative. And that's also a way of, for schools to be able to identify, are they at full implementation too? So we have a rubric and some things we're working on so that schools can identify, okay, where are we really good at? What do we still need to work on? And when have we hit full implementation? And then taking that data on, is it reducing or hitting the goals that we want? So is it reducing discipline one? Is it reducing racial disparities? Do teachers have better community and relationships in their classrooms? Have we engaged family and community members in a different way than we have before, so on and so forth. And then ongoing training for new and returning personnel. So we're trying to map that out in terms of how we continue to train people, and then as new people enter into our district, how they get properly trained and kind of catch up with wherever their building is.
And part of that is identifying a restorative practices lead in each school building. That would work in conjunction with admin and then with us. So we're still working that out right now.
And then establish restorative culture and language in the building. So that's really just outlining for each building what that looks like, how it should look, how do you do that. And then inform students and families the shift of proactive restorative practices. And so that's a big one I don't think we've done really well at so far. I think some people in the community have an idea, but we've got to find ways and develop ways to kind of get families, one, more involved in the process, but just get them educated and informed on it, especially when you have parents who come in, if it is a discipline issue, and they're like, what, you're not going to do this to the kid? And having to help them understand this new approach to how we're handling certain situations in the building, and then possibly getting parents involved in the buildings in different ways in terms of restorative practices.
So that's an area for growth, and the other piece is that one thing we haven't done yet is explicitly talk to students the way I think we have in our peer mediators class of, this is what this looks like, this is what a restorative, this is why we're doing it, this is what a restorative conversation looks like. We tend to do it only when they understand circles, but not necessarily the bigger picture. So I think there's some explicit training and teaching we could do there.
And then the last benchmark is just taking preventative measures to improve school climate. So that's just outlining in the long-term plan for each building, basically things that you can do to make sure that certain things aren't happening or be able to recognize when things aren't happening that's preventing you from being able to build that climate and that culture. And then I mentioned before, the last one is we created the behavioral continuum. And so that's something we're working on in conjunction with the new discipline policy so that there's something that's aligned. So there's concrete action steps that buildings have that align with the new policy that discipline policy that's being worked on. So that, again, teachers and admin have some kind of a framework to work off of and to be able to be sure that they're doing it through a racial and a restorative lens, essentially. And that's where we are. Oh.
And we just want to remind you that making an enormous shift like this, Joyce calls it a sea change, it's a philosophical shift to restorative practices. It's challenging, it's nonlinear, it's messy, you go back and forth, it's not a straight line. And it kind of, for me, it feels like I have to keep reminding people I'm working with that it's not one or the other thing. It's just the way we do business. It's not something, it's the way we are. So we need to continue to have explicit conversations about the process.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize how fantastic our restorative practices facilitators are, and the change that they're making is really what we're looking for. And so I really appreciate you all being here tonight and talking about this. I don't know if any of the board members have any questions?
Thank you so much. The question I have really is trying to understand how what you just presented weaves into classroom behavior management, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, I can answer that as a teacher. It is, again, it's sort of like the basement and the ceiling of classroom management. So it's, to us, it's sort of like you wouldn't say, hi, welcome to 8th grade language arts, open your book to page 1 and start reading out loud. Like, you do some community building. This is community building. So the circles are the way to start to get to know each other, to build trust, to have the students see the teacher as a person, not as just an authority figure. So it creates that. People also use them as a way to discuss classroom rules and classroom contracts. We use norms in circles, and those norms apply to how you should behave in a classroom as well. And the norms really get internalized when you're doing the circles well, so that affects the culture of respect and everything in the classroom. So when you're doing circles proactively well, it's like the ratio is indirect. As soon as the proactive circles are great, then the misbehavior goes down.
I mean, I'm sorry, I just want to add on. So really, if you look at it, the base premise is the people you have relationships with and that you value, you are less likely to want to cause harm or to misbehave, right? You don't want to disappoint. And so students, when they have relationships, better relationships, one with their classroom members and the teacher, they are less likely to do those things because they have those relationships. But again, you can build norms. I had one situation where a teacher that I was training circles with, and there were issues in the classroom, and we did a circle about community, and it ended up being 3 consecutive circles where we stayed on the same topic that then led to the kids rewriting the classroom expectations. And so they reset the classroom expectations, and then they also outlined, when I don't meet these classroom expectations, this is how it impacts the community, right? And so they took full ownership so it can filter out formally as well as informally because you're building community.
That's really helpful. I think what I'm trying to understand a little bit is, because I know this is a relatively new practice in our schools, is that if there are classroom practices that are still being done that are counterproductive to restorative justice practices, for example, and I'm not well versed in this, I just know from personal experience, like behavior charts, is something like that. Is that within the purview of this type of work, or is that something totally separate? Because to me, it's hard to totally differentiate them as two different things, and I see that it all relates to the school culture, if that makes sense.
My short answer to that, so usually behavior charts are individualized, right? So either it's coming through a special ed lens or there's something where you've contract. So you can do behavior contracts. I wouldn't say behavior charts necessarily fall under RP, not that it's not RP. That's just more of an individualized kind of a thing. And so I wouldn't say you're going to never see behavior charts just because a school or a district is restorative.
Just because a teacher is implementing a practice like that does not necessarily mean that it is damaging to the restorative.
No, but the process to getting to that behavior chart should be restorative, right? And so when you're sitting down at a meeting, if you're calling that parent in, so it's even looking at how you do meetings, right? So a kid is causing problems in the room, all the teachers are frustrated on the team, they call the parent in, we tell the parent everything the child is doing wrong, and then the parent is either upset or it's like, I know, I get it at home, and then the teachers or whoever decide what's gonna happen next, right? But a restorative response to that is that we're all sitting at the table or in circle, and we're using a certain format, and we're discussing the issue, right? And so, and sometimes it can very well be appropriate to have that child in there. You have to look at what the age is and what you're talking about. And then everybody in that community is coming to an agreement on where they think we should go best, right? So there's a restorative way about getting to those things.
Sort of like a lens, another lens, right? As well as a practice, as well as a culture.
There were some other questions.
I have some questions. One of the things is really something that I'm noticing, which is, in my mind, and I think it's in alignment with what you all presented, restorative work is about repairing harm rather than about coercion or control. Yet, and I think this is part of culture change, we're still talking about misbehaviors. And we're also talking a lot about children changing behaviors or children changing approaches. And in some ways, I feel like it seems like we have some more culture shift to work on in order to have less coercive oriented language. So I wonder if that is something that has, and I guess the other thing that the question I had is, how often are adults in District 65 utilizing restorative practices where there are no children, right? Like, how are adults using it for adult-to-adult relationship building or adult-to-adult conflict resolution? Whether that's internal or also with external stakeholders.
It's happening. I think it's a room for growth. Yeah, definitely. And that's part of what we're trying to move toward with a way to do a format for staff meetings and grade level meetings so that you can begin to hear each other a different way.
So we've started some staff-to-staff circles. We have not, I feel like, gotten to the degree of when restorative conversations can happen when there is issues or conflict between staff, right? And so, I agree that is where it should go, and that is the goal. Because when we say that everybody's doing it, right? So you're using it in your own relationships or professional relationships in the building. It's not just teacher to student, it is staff to staff, staff to student, student to student. And yes, and parent community to school, right? So it is all of those facets. But again, it's a process, and we're not fully there yet. But eventually, if we're doing it with fidelity, then yes, all of those things would be being addressed. And how we talk about it, so like you brought like misbehavior, right? So if you're using RP language, it's about how is the behavior impacting you or others, right? So we're not labeling it misbehavior. Well, we have this expectation, we agreed on these expectations as a community, you know, how is that affecting people? So you're not saying, oh, you're misbehaving. It's about what your action was and how it's impacting you or others, and then what are we going to do to correct it so that everybody can walk into a space and into this community and feel comfortable being in this community. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And I think that it's important, if we're really looking for a culture shift, that we be able to adopt new language as well and new understanding. Because we are a part of the culture. So I guess the other thing that I think is just a reality is when we're talking with individuals, we may be more thoughtful and responsive to how our language affects the individual, but when the individual is not in the space, we may be less thoughtful or responsive to how an individual may feel. So, you know, as I think adults responsible for adopting and holding this culture change, how do we talk about what we expect from children when children are not right in front of us, right? So are we talking about expectations and agreements in person, and then in private or when we're removed, talking about behavior and misbehavior and more like coercive and controlling terminology? Or are we all the time talking about expectations, and also how we are helping to facilitate meeting of expectations?
All the time. So that, and that becomes the struggle, right? Because we're essentially asking people to change their thinking and approach, right? And that it's not that we're teaching kids how to be restorative. We are restorative in everything that we do. And so as we were doing some research, it's teaching that language and how do you talk about kids proactively, right? And that we're not talking about how such and such is a jerk and da-da-da-da-da because it's just two teachers talking and nobody's around, right? I'm frustrated about this kid, but there's an approach and a way about talking about that. And that takes a little bit longer than some of the more direct stuff. But yes, the idea is if you are a school that is at full implementation and doing it with fidelity, then those discussions would be happening differently as well. So it is something we would be addressing or looking at. Yeah.
You know, if I can also say that the restorative practices is the bedrock of our student behavior and the discipline policy that we're going to be talking about next week. And so, you know, we'll really be illustrating that some more.
Okay, great. I did have one other question that was a little more specific. I had someone in our community express concern about restorative practice being used in a situation where the child who felt harmed did not feel comfortable participating in the restorative circle. So the child that was harmed did not feel like the circle was repairing anything. They felt further harmed by the circle. Is there a consent process with the children to talk to them about, is this something that you're ready for, and do you feel like this is going to actually restore? Like, how does that typically look for the child and the family?
So when it's a more formal situation, as you're speaking of, it's the opposite of our judicial system that's offender-centered, it's victim-centered. So we don't go forward if the victim doesn't want to. Now, that being said, the circle is its own entity. So sometimes we can set it up as best as possible and pre-conference as much as possible and go in with the best intentions, and something else could happen. So that can happen sometimes.
And when we say pre-conference, that's where you identify if that person is ready, and it's also an opportunity to help prepare them and make them feel comfortable moving forward with the process. But it is the person who's been harmed has to be comfortable doing it. But when you pre-conference, the person who's caused the harm, if they're not taking ownership, then we don't do it then on that side either, because we're not going to put someone in a situation and the person who caused the harm isn't taking ownership, and then they're reharmed again or re-traumatized again in some way. So the pre-conferencing piece is hugely important, and it's why we do it, right? But the door is always open. It doesn't matter if a situation happened 6 months ago. If the person who was harmed says, you know what, I'm ready to have that conversation now, then we start to pull those pieces back together to see if we can put it together. And so even if it doesn't happen the next day or a week later, if they ever come and say, and we tell them, the door is open whenever you're ready. But on both ends, we won't do it if the person who's been harmed does not feel comfortable, or the person who has caused harm is not taking ownership.
And are there any prevailing points of feedback that you all have gotten in terms of how adults feel impacted by, or feel that their practices have shifted and the impact of that on their relationships or their teaching practices? Any feedback that you all have gotten, prevailing feedback?
You've had a little more positive feedback than I have. And it's not because, I don't think it's because we haven't been doing good work. It's, I think, where I will own it for, at least for one of my buildings, that we haven't done a good job of communicating back out what we're doing in terms of bringing children together. In terms of teachers seeing the proactive circles as a tool for community building, I have had tremendous success, and then that has led to really good responsive circles when there's been a class-wide issue. So I think they really, and those teachers have taken it and gone with it. So I think they really see it as a way to be. That's what I've heard back, is a different way to be.
Yeah. I've gotten quite a bit of feedback. The best feedback is when I'm just walking through the building down the hallway and I see random circles happening. And I'm like, yes, they're happening without me having to be there. But a lot of teachers see the value in it. They talk about how much they like it. I've had one teacher just was like, I just like my kids more. Like, knowing them on a different level just has helped me to just like kids, and even when they're like,
Having a hard time.
yes, right? And that's huge, because teachers are humans, and we have to accept that sometimes we're just going to make human mistakes. But when I build these relationships, it makes me practice in a different way with how I interact with students.
Because you see the whole child as a whole person.
Right. Yeah, and so I'm hearing a lot more I've had some teachers that 80% of it should be social emotional learning, no matter if you're tying it to curriculum or not. But some of them are like, I don't even want to deal with the curriculum piece. I just never get to talk to my kids in this way and understand them in this way. And so they only want to stay in the SEL realm of things when they do host circles. But overall, most teachers are going with it and building on it themselves and reporting back. And so I've got overwhelmingly positive response to how they're utilizing or how they like circles. And again, it's mainly around circles because we haven't been able to dive deeper into the other pieces, which is what our hope is next year.
Although I will say in one of my schools, we've been doing a lot of conferences, a lot of informal conferences with students, and I can feel this shift, even in the short amount of time that I've been there, in how students are, in their problem solving. I can feel a shift. You had a question too.
Yeah, I had two questions. The first is, given that behaviors will still happen and there will still, you talked about bringing students in rather than pushing them out, which is fantastic. There will still be times when students have to be pushed out for the sake of community and whatever it was that happened. Do you find that RPs are having an impact on how that is happening, on their experience, so that they're not just being excluded, but the way that the school is getting to that, punitive decision is changing the way kids are being suspended?
That's what we're working toward, and I would say that that's been the case. I can say for sure in my schools that we try as many different other things we can possibly do, including restorative practices, short of out-of-school suspension. And when that does have to happen, then we are working on having reintegration meetings and circles before they come back. so that you're welcoming them back to the community. Let's talk about either repairing the harm before they go out or as they come back in.
Right. And so that's a bigger piece or a bigger push for next year. Like, we're trying to build buildings for what's your capacity in terms of what community service can we integrate within the building and/or connections we need to make outside of school. What are some resources that we want to utilize in a different way in Evanston when it comes to discipline? So if it is a kid who is vaping in the bathroom, say, and usually that would be like an out-of-school suspension or whatever. And so restorative practices will take a different approach. Maybe we do a restorative conference, maybe they do some community service work, and maybe we partner with peer services and they have a 3-session workshop for students on drug abuse and education, right? And so that would be a more restorative approach versus you're out of school for 3 days and we'll see you when you come back. And so that takes a lot of community building and re-strategizing. And so that's a push we're going for, so that buildings have those options to take advantage of those. And that's where you keep the kids in, right? They're not out of school, they're learning and they're repairing the harm all at the same time, if that makes sense.
Thank you. The second question was about your time. And what percentage would you guess you're spending time proactively planning professional development, facilitating in a way that you would say is ideal because you kind of mapped it out, versus being reactive and pulled into situations as they've arisen? What would you say the split of your time is?
It depends on the building.
Agreed. I mean, if I hate to give an estimate because I don't have hard numbers on that, but I would say 50-50 or 60-40, where 60 is responsive, maybe 40 is reactive, and that's just because each building is at a different learning process and a different learning step. But I will say, at least in the middle schools that we've been in, admin is really taking to it and is willing and wanting to go that direction and really learn. So all the administrators we've been working with have been very open to saying, I want to learn this. How do I go about this?
And partnering.
Yeah, consulting with me, or they'll say, is this appropriate for a restorative conference? Like, they'll ask if they're not sure. And so they're open to the learning process and going down that road. We're just not fully there yet.
And because it's the end of the year, for me, I will say the responsive is getting more and the proactive is getting less, and just as I'm finishing training on circles. But what is helpful about doing both is that when I am doing responsive and I'm in the office and I'm seeing a pattern of why kids are coming down there, then that informs what we proactively circle about. So that's been really helpful. So it's a lot of like online, how do you manage yourself online? Why do we cause disruptions in class? How do we feel? What's negative behavior versus bullying? So like all those things that keep coming down to the office, then we proactively explore it. Respect, conflict, all of it.
You want to go first? Go. Sure. Sorry, I'm just leaning in. Well, I just want to thank you too, because this work is clearly really important. I would say hard. I mean, I'm sure it's a passion of love, but it's so nuanced and dealing with people in very vulnerable situations, and you guys obviously have great expertise in it. So it brings a lot of confidence for us, and I'm sure the community, to hear from you directly. So thank you for being here. I think I have 3 questions. I'm trying to make it 3 or less. The first, because Megan, you had just mentioned bullying as part of that conversation, or as part of one of the things that you might be talking about. If you could situate RP in the context of bullying, because we're certainly seeing from our communities, and to your point about understanding and sharing how this all works, that, in the case of bullying, where it might be repeated behaviors over time, how does RP work, or how is it embedded with other things in those types of situations?
I have a great example. I just did this the other day for actually a 3rd grade class where it was a child who's being officially bullied, right? And that's something we talk about, is the difference that there's the misnomer of negative behavior versus bullying, but this is true bullying. And so what we did, we established a protocol, and this teacher and I found it and it's something I've been working on all year. And it's basically, first the teacher conferences with the students individually who are doing the bullying and the victim, so the victim and the offenders. And when this first started, when this behavior first started. And then when it didn't go away, then she contacted parents. Then when it's continued, she called me, and we had our conference, a formal restorative conference with just us. So the offenders, the victims' parents knew that we were doing it, but the victim did not want to be in the circle. So it was the bulliers or the offenders, me and the teacher. And the teacher named the specific behavior that they were doing and said, this ends now, and let's talk about some strategies on how you're going, and what you can do to treat this person, welcome this person into this classroom. And so then we wrote a behavior contract, and we said, you will not do A, B, C, D, and you're going to sign this, and there's a confidentiality that we're going to keep this within our circle. We're going to let your parents know about this. Principal, AP is going to know about this. You guys are going to sign it, and we're going to do an official check back in a week, and then we'll do an informal check-in in 2 weeks. But if the behavior continues, then it will be a more serious disciplinary issue, and your parents will come and talk to the principal and the AP about it. So it was a little more low-level bullying, and it was third grade, but it was definitely, by definition, it was bullying. And so it was very effective. The behavior has stopped. And the teacher found it very helpful to have some steps to follow.
And did the victim, because he or she wasn't involved, what communication then goes to that person about the contract or?
Not, she wasn't supposed to know about the contract, right? So it was that she knows me, and she knew that I and her teacher were talking to the kids about their behavior.
Okay. So they're just seeing the outcome of it. Thank you.
But I do want to emphasize, because there will be incidents where you're just going to have to get direct about an incident, but part of that those proactive circles is a lot about talking about community and how every person is valued and how we honor the community. And so when you are truly addressing those things head on, it should be minimizing the amount of incidents you are having in regards to bullying. And then when you have hopefully that very small percentage, you would take those steps. But that is why the proactive piece in RP is so hugely important, is because it addresses it on a large scale to minimize how much you're seeing of these other incidents. And if you are doing it with fidelity, it will be that small percentage, right? And so again, what she described to you should only be about 20% of your time in an entire building, right? No matter if it's bullying or just negative behavior that has escalated to admin or whatever, that should be a very small amount of time you are using for RP in addressing those issues. All of it should be addressed on the other end of things, if that makes sense.
Am I correct in saying, though, that it sounds like you're doubling down at the middle school level now? Was that not as much of a focus from a preventative, because clearly the stakes get higher right, in middle school level when you have issues of bullying and the confrontations get higher. So I guess the question is, if you're like, even though this is not linear, if we were looking at, you're here with fidelity, 100% fidelity across all schools, but particularly the question of middle schools, what do we think in terms of time and culture shift time? Is that the 3 years ahead?
At least 3.
What happens in the interim, I guess, is the question, because we used to have this tool set that we all acknowledge was not a good tool set for outcomes overall in the school community or the society. We don't have that tool set yet. We don't have that tool set anymore, but we aren't yet where we need to be in implementing the new set of practices and knowing that the preventative stuff, as you've called it, antecedents, right? I don't know. Well, so I'm just wondering, in this 3-year period, and I know give or take, what can we be expecting? Is it a mix and match? And then at the end, how do we as a board know that we've gotten to that place of fidelity?
Yeah.
Final question.
So Megan and Teresa talked about this a little bit earlier, that what we intend to do is to make our district a restorative practices district. And so next year, we're going to be, well, actually starting this summer, we're doing a train the trainer model so that we will have people working in every school who will be helping to implement these practices. You know, we're modeling this after some other districts that have done this, like Oakland and Denver. This is a 3 to 5 year rollout to be really effective in this way. So yes, there's going to be some practices that we're going to shift. That's going to take a while for people to learn and to be good at. We're going from, you know, as I described really well, punishment to repairing harm. And that is a big culture shift for all of us in terms of how we think about developing community in our classrooms and you know, wanting to improve that quality. So there'll be things that we still have in play, and next week we'll share with you our behavior continuum that we've developed and that Teresa and Megan have been very involved in developing in terms of a leveled system of how we're going to respond to certain kinds of behavior at certain areas. So, but it's a process. It'll be a process.
I guess then I'd pose the question back to the board and to the administration is how do we know, because we're accountable, we should be accountable, that we have reached fidelity, or how are we going to monitor that on an ongoing basis? Because it's clearly important that we invest the right resources in capacity building, and to do it, it doesn't, you know, it takes a lot of intense work.
So the trainer model, as Joyce says, is our intent is to have presence in each of the schools. So then there's a fidelity question of, do we really have presence in, is that growing school by school in terms of the activities that we have?
Well, and who's being trained? If you get 2 classroom teachers trained in a school, they're not as available as a social worker to pop up when a circle presents itself and help facilitate. Are they certain staff members, or
Yes.
is it? Like who?
And I'm just meaning not just,
type of
did we
staff?
go through the activities,
Right.
but, you know, someone like you guys going in and observing.
Right.
Is that you know what fidelity is.
Right.
Are we at that best practice level, or are we getting there?
Right.
And having some mechanism.
Yeah, so we've worked on a rubric, and then the 3-year implementation plan outlines where you should be by year 1, year 2, year 3, right? And so there are things that they will have to guide them that they should be able to report on, that you would be able to see to say, okay, here's where school A is, here's where school B is. And then you'll always have your hard concrete numbers. I feel like no matter if you're at full implementation or not, if the school is truly taking on the shift, you should gradually start to see reductions in numbers. And then at full implementation, hopefully we're hitting goals that we want to hit as a district. But there will be some pieces in play for you to be able to see where each school is, and for an administrator to report and say, you know, I've got 100% of teachers doing circles on a weekly and or biweekly basis. I've got this happening if they're following the guide that we give them.
So we have a 3-year implementation plan and a rubric, an implementation rubric that we're following.
And then you would be assessing that rubric or the implementation of that rubric with the schools.
So hopefully, if we train the lead person, right? And so that becomes a track movement or stipend type person, right, to take on this extra role. And they create they'll create a team. So just like there's a PBIS team, RTA, there's a team, right? And so there's a team that's meeting and looking over the data and seeing where people are, and that lead is consulting with us. So we're still going into buildings, but her and I can't be in every single building, so we need people who's a lead who is working with admin to do some of these things, and then we come in and help and consult or help do whatever we need to do as well in those particular buildings, and then having those meetings to say, okay, here's where you are, where do you need support at, what are you doing really well at, where are we making some mistakes, so on and so forth. But having those rubrics and those things in place to be able to assess that, and it's not just some random conversation per se. Yeah.
And I imagine some of that will be going through the school climate teams.
Correct. So, and we kind of put together a criteria, so when principals reach out to find that lead or somebody who wants to take it, they know that they have to be on the climate team. One of the requirements is that they're willing, if they're not already on climate, that they're willing to sit on climate. Because some of that PD and some of the things they will be doing should be going through climate anyway.
Will that rubric be available to families? How will they have an idea of what restorative practices should look like, or what they should be experiencing, and how to give feedback?
Okay. You want me to? I was gonna say, so RP is about transparency. Nothing is really secret, so they can have access to that. And one of the things we are talking about is also having trainings for parents and community members in terms of circles and having those experiences, but also training for someone who may want to take on what would be an appropriate role in the building in regards to RP. So there is an element where we really want to bring families in. Right now, we're just in the stage of really like getting things down and solidifying and finalizing things. So we're just not at that point where we're ready to be like, this is it, and publicly send it out. We've kind of got to narrow down and get our final draft and say, okay, we're here and we're ready to like share that information with everybody. We just haven't gotten there just yet. Well, I can see it. Okay.
And we can surely come back to the board and share the information from the rubric and the lessons learned, like we're doing tonight, set this as a baseline and then come back on a regular basis to be able to report where we're at and where we're going. We can also probably, can we, let me ask, put this in the handbook or think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the only thing I was going to add, building on what was already said, was that partnership with parents and families and community will be integral to really the success of this, and both on the in the moment when these things are happening, but really I think on the prevention, and as you've described, that restorative culture that we're trying to move towards, and Joyce mentioned as well, in our student handbook, we've talked about both for those who are new to our community, but providing regular monthly opportunities for learning about what our restorative practices look like. But also, we know that already we see examples of schools, PTA meetings, community meetings being held in circle format. We've used the circle format to do survey or learning about what people's thinking is about certain issues. And so really starting to use that practice. And even in our dialogue, I think at a board and a district management level, learning to model that, because really it all starts from the top. And so both in our day-to-day in business, but also in our work with each other, really starting to engage those practices is going to be, it's a big shift. Our instinct isn't to go towards, or our society really works against the practices of a restorative model. And I would say that will require a huge lift on everybody's part to make it meaningful. It's not something that's going to suddenly be born, and as most labor practices do take a lot of effort, so.
So just to add to your comment on Dalib, I think it's really important to get parents on board earlier on. The model we know, so whereas like inside the school, you're still testing that out. I think getting people to understand what that looks like, and getting parents on board earlier on, especially in, from my perspective, in what's been happening this past year regarding bullying. I think that's a tool that parents can have on the outside to work with other parents and understand how parents can mitigate some of these incidences that are happening to alleviate some of the work that you might have to do within the schools. So just, as an idea and suggestion, we have our Welcome Center, and they offer classes for parents, and I know that you're inside the schools, but just to give parents kind of like a taste or a sequence for, what the model is, like that isn't too labor intensive, because we already know what the model should look like. And so to be able to give parents that tool, I think is really important. I love that you're bringing students on board, and I think that that's crucial to the success of this really being embedded into the school culture. So thank you for considering our kids, and I think oftentimes they're so much better you know, apt to like take care of this stuff. I've seen kids do it on the playground at the elementary school level, and I think that it's an incredible leadership opportunity for our middle school students that will go on to ETHS, where they have a peer mediation system there. So to be able to follow it through to ETHS, I think is really important. So I'm really happy to see that that's taking place. So I only have one question, and that's currently we are not collecting any data on how frequently this is happening. You know, I think sharing circles are different than restorative circles, and are we collecting?
Informally, yeah, I've been
Informally.
keeping track of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like at least how many we have taken place,
Yeah.
why they're taking place.
When, how, why.
Yeah.
And
So
the
those,
lack of recidivism, which is significant
Right.
in that.
We
And
have
I
a,
think it would just be great to be able to share those successes, especially I think that there's constituents in our community that don't understand how we're doing it, and you're right, it does look different from school to school, but as we work towards the, you know, on the 5-year plan, I think it'd be great to give some success stories and give a sense of how often this is taking place, and just, you know, success stories for why this work is so important and how often it's happening, and reducing suspensions or other type of you know, of interventions that happen at the school level. But just thank you.
no, I
for
agree.
all the work.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
good suggestion. Thanks.
I also want to echo, you know, the support for all the work that you're doing, and you're really laying the groundwork for us as a district to abide by SB 100, right? And that's our discipline law. And again, it's supposed to be focused on reducing harm, right? Harm that specifically has happened to marginalized communities across the country. So thank you for this. Again, you're laying the groundwork and the foundation for how that's going to help drive our discipline policy here in the district. So, you know, continuing on the issue around, you know, just sharing information about, you know, some of the good work that's happening. Have individual schools shared any of these stories about it? Are there restorative justice practices with parents at all? And why the reason why I asked that is, and I think, again, we, at the end of the day, you know, if leadership's buying in, they should be communicated out to the parent community, right? So that, I think, is critical, and then teachers as well. You know, if there's a way that they can communicate it out to the parents, like, you know, this is something new that we adopted. Again, these folks are on the front lines, and again, have that. You know, once they get that lens and once they buy into it, they should be sharing it with parents. I know as a parent, and I'm sure most parents might be able to share this, but I'll speak for myself. I try. Again, it's not easy being a parent. It's not easy. You know, the adult-child relationship can be difficult, like you said. You know, we're human beings. But how can we get to that point where again we're able to be accountable, which is at the end of the day, I think one of the big focuses of what this work is that we hold ourselves accountable for our behavior and are able to find and heal whatever wrong and harm that's been caused because of behavior. So I, as a parent, would love to see, you know, what that looks like. And I'm reminded by some of the stories, you know, when I was teaching, you know, again, when you talk about, you know, social contracts, I mean, that is something that I started my school year off, and I taught little ones, and the little ones can tell you how we should behave, right? And we would role play and talk about, well, if this kid says something mean to this kid, you know, how do you think they're going to feel? So really kind of just having these role plays and then building out these contracts, and I would write down what they say. Okay, so we should do this, and we shouldn't do this. Again, kids are just can teach us so much. So again, I echo my colleague Rebecca. When, you know, again, also with the peer-to-peer, I think, you know, kids being able to facilitate these conversations and maybe getting some of them to come and talk to the little ones at the elementary school level as this work progresses would be something, you know, that is just very powerful. I know we do reading buddies. We can do restorative practice buddies. You know?
Yeah.
You know, so that might be something to think about. Also, you know, have you thought about maybe looking at, you know, we currently have parent engagement groups across the district. So as the work goes on, you know, we have the BPAC, we have ACC, the African American Caribbean, you know, parent groups, the Head Start Parent Policy Committee. You know, those are, you know, audiences that are already built into what we do. So as you move the work along and you want to communicate with parents, so that would be
Yeah.
welcome.
Yeah, we thought of that too. And we have been, our schools have been communicating out in newsletter form.
Good.
In this is something we all struggle with, is like, in terms of the discipline part, there's a lot of confidentiality. And so
Yeah.
you can't broadcast out necessarily what some of the things, but we can speak in generalities about other things, right?
Absolutely.
But that is a shift we're moving towards for next year. I think for this year was really, for some middle schools, it was starting fresh, and so it was really just trying to figure out ourselves this year. But now we're definitely at a stage where we can start growing that capacity across the community and family and really bringing those people in. And so, again, all the things you've mentioned are things that we have discussed throughout this year of how do we want to integrate that? Do we want to train parents? How do we want to bring them in? How could we utilize them, and how may they want to be utilized, so on and so forth. So you should start seeing more next year in terms of that.
That's great. And
Yeah.
also think about maybe utilizing social media. I know we have a lot of parent groups that get together. There's a lot of misconceptions
Yes.
that go on in these social, social media groups. So maybe creating a video that kind of shows,
Yeah.
having the peer group
Yeah.
show, okay, well, this is what a restorative justice practice looks like.
Yeah, we had that conversation last week.
And that I think would be very powerful, because again, I think again, we will make assumptions, right?
Yeah.
Because if we don't have complete information, and that's just us being human beings.
Yeah, I
So,
agree.
whatever we can do to exhaust whatever means of communication to communicate parents about this work, the better, right?
I agree.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thanks, Sergio.
All right.
Thank you.
right,
Thank you for, well, I just have one quick comment and then question. Comment is, in terms of how are we going to hold ourselves accountable for this? I think one, some of the implementation data is important to gather, but I do think we also need to think about what outcome data we need to see. Certainly the suspension data, I think we can look at 5 essentials, but I know the several members of the board have consistently pushed for the last couple of years on getting more holistic social emotional assessment or, outcomes and measurements. So I would again, I guess, push the administration and the board to think about what SEL measurements, outcome measurements would look like and how we would gather that. We are investing a lot of time and energy, rightfully so, I think, into building positive school climates, but we do need a way to capture how we are, how we're doing. And so I think it's a worthwhile investment of time to figure out what those assessments might look like. And I do believe that there are many organizations out there that can help us with that. My question is a little bit more about implementation. Just thinking, I know we're going from the 4 schools this year to district-wide next year, and I know that schools and educators are in various forms already using a lot of these. But I do think, this is a big culture shift, and this is a big, I would imagine there's a fairly steep learning curve on a lot of this. So how are we thinking about, I know we've talked about, professional development, but how are we, can you give us a little bit more information on how this is going to be implemented and how we're going to make sure that our educators feel like they have the tools they need to be able to implement restorative practices with fidelity?
Sure. You taking it? Well, part of, there's small things and there's big things. One small thing that I think is going to be highly effective is, for example, in middle school, there's putting, for like grade level meetings or team meetings, putting the, on the agenda for the meeting, where are you putting circles in play in your curriculum, having teams work together, having people work cross-curricularly to put them in. We have a couple tools that could be implemented that you start with the Common Core state standard and shape the circle around that. So we've got tools that educators could use. By having the restorative practice lead in the school, we ideally would hope that would be a teacher, because we think classroom teachers tend to teach classroom teachers the best. And that person, we model and share out as much as possible about the positive impact, and then the one-to-one coaching that we can provide.
I would add, also there's a build or by moving towards a policy and also our procedures really being focused on restorative practices, I think number one is that there's a focus on everybody will understand that shared language. Right now, while we have that, it's not indoctrinated in both in our policy, but neither in our handbook. I mean, it has this year. We did a significant shift in our student handbook, but in terms of shared learning and like a manual that all teachers have access to, we've had a pretty robust restorative practices website, I guess you could say, full of a lot of resources. However, really the integration of PBIS and a lot of our school climate work, really getting these cleaned up will help accelerate the professional learning vision that's going to come out this year. I've been able to sit in on some of the workshops that Teresa and Megan have led to really support the principles, and I think as a result of that, you've seen a greater use in the schools, and at least I've heard of it. So next year, we've also got a focus on our professional learning calendar. We've been working Joyce has been to a number of meetings, I've been to a number of the meetings with our curriculum instruction department to reshape our professional development calendar to integrate the professional development for our teachers so that it's a part of the regular business versus an add-on or anything sort.
And really, that behavior continuum that we're working on is really that bridge, I think, between the policy that's in the discipline policy and what happens in the classroom. And we worked that hard through a restorative lens. So there's all sorts of tools in there that we can help teachers work with. And again, a lot of them are already doing this.
And the long-term plan we're working on is pretty concrete. Like if anybody walks in a building and reads it, they know what they need to be doing and how they can do it, right? So all of it is really concrete. So I think once we get all those things finalized and ready for next year and you're able to look at those, I think it'll better answer some of the questions you have today. Yeah.
If I may, we started tonight celebrating staff, and we couldn't have a more wonderful presentation to celebrate outstanding work by staff, really from the ground up, and then working with it at the policy structure to be able to go forward. So just on behalf of all of us, thank you so much for the hard work, the dedication. You can feel it, and you can feel the narrative that we've been talking about in terms of culture change. You're at the forefront of that, and I couldn't be more proud of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
everyone.
Thank you.
We will shift next to our ACC update. Jamila, want to come join us?
Good evening, and Dr. Allen and Dr. Osher are going to join me at the table. And you should know that we have two parents who are a teacher and two parents. Is the teacher still here? Yes. Ms. Burkell is here as one of the teachers, and Mr. Wilson and Dr. Coleman, who are ACC parents, are also here. And just want you to know that we're all here together. All right. Before I actually get started, I do want to do just a few more thank yous. I do want to thank Dr. Gorn for appointing a person in the central office to provide support and leadership for the ACC program. I often assert that although it is a program that is housed in one school, it is a district program, so it has been very useful, and so we really appreciate the fact you have done that. I want to thank Dr. Stacy Beardsley because she has helped us this year, each member of the curriculum instruction team, to support one school, and I got assigned Oakton, and that has been really wonderful because it gave me a role and a responsibility in the building that really gave us access to some more information that has really been helpful and useful. And I want to thank Dr. Latasha Green. She's a new role this year. She sought me out early on to see how we might be able to work together. And I'll make a few references in the report about some plans that we have. So at the central office, we're communicating, and this is a wonderful thing. So we are the team. The doctors are in to talk to you about the ACC program this evening. So I'll walk through the memo a little bit. I know that you had it ahead of time. And of course, then we'll take some questions. And certainly if you want to have any questions for our teachers and parents, that would be wonderful too. So I started off with the Sankofa quote because it is the heart of our program, the idea that we look back to what our ancestors have done and we see the struggles that they have undertaken and we say, what do we need to do to carry forward the work? And ACC certainly falls into that category. When we think about what happened in 2005, in a way, it's the same fight that we've been fighting for more than 60 years. We've had this racial predictability about student achievement, and the group that convened at that time discovered this idea of, well, what if we put forward an African-centered program? So they had done research throughout that year, greatly informed by the work at the Woodlawn School, and they put forward a proposal to pilot an African-centered program. So that proposal, I believe, was approved at the June meeting, and it was implemented in September. And I always like to lift that up because it speaks to both the urgency of the passion at the time, but also that there was a very short window to kind of get the thing going. And so you had a group of people, parents, administrators, and individuals who were flying, building the plane as we were starting to fly it. I do want to lift up something that was in the initial proposal where it said the District 65 African-Centered Program will be embedded within the larger effort of improving the achievement of African American students. This effort, along with increased use of multicultural materials and curricular adjustments in social studies and fine arts, is at the heart of the recommendation. So you could see at that point, there was a certain level of understanding that was shaping the program. And so, of course, over time, we're learning more and we're expanding our understanding, so we've made some changes. But while we're making changes, I always want to acknowledge the commitment that it took to start it's such a bold thing to put in a public school an African-centered program. And so, of course, over the time that we've had the program up and running, we have revealed its strengths and some opportunities, some weakness, some vulnerabilities, and so we'll be speaking to a few of those things tonight. So I want to start off in talking about one of the changes that we made since the beginning of the program. So we talked about initially it was embedded within the larger effort. And so this is one of the things that we're trying to navigate. What is unique about the program and what about it needs to be in line with what we're doing district-wide? So we did adopt what we call an African-centered pedagogy. Pedagogy is about how you teach. A lot of people really focus on what it is we're teaching, but pedagogy is about how you're teaching. So for example, I lifted up in here that one of the practices that we do collective practices that you're probably familiar with from culturally responsive pedagogy. So we, in our morning routine, assign children groupings by the day of their birth. This is an African-centered practice as well. And they had some resources that they were given, and they had a task that they were given, and it was quite an undertaking to watch them navigate what does it mean to work in different size groups, have different amounts of resources, and work together to make sure that the resources are deployed collectively so that the entire community could achieve the task. So the grouping and the way we structured the task is how we're teaching, and that is a manifestation of African-centered pedagogy. So contrasted with the content of what we're teaching, which are the Nguzo Saba and the Ma'at, which frame what we do in our morning routines. So this year we focused on Ujamaa cooperative economics, so they learned about Julius Nyerere. We learned about Booker T. Washington and Julius Rosenwald, who worked together to fund something called the Rosenwald Schools. And I don't know if many of you know about that. We actually have a parent, one of our teachers, she had her mother-in-law went to a Rosenwald school. So it's just that is some of the content that we explore to attain the curricular standards. So that's kind of the contrast. I do want to lift up that we use the Peter Murrell African-centered pedagogy, which is mentioned in here, and has 5 essential practices. So the engagement and participation practices, identity development, community integrity practices, practices of inquiry, and meaning making. And what is unique about the pedagogy is not that you do one of those things in each of the lessons, that you're constantly trying to do all of those things as you're constructing learning experiences. So that's where the hard work comes in. So then we can move over and talk about what some of the challenges that we've had in terms of the enrollment and demographics. So we want to thank our RAD department. They put in a yeoman's effort and really updated our records going back as many as 10 years to be able to provide us with this data, to give us a look at who has been served in the African-centered program. We know that it was initially intended to serve children of African descent, but of course it is open to all children in District 65. So you can see here that we have predominantly African-American students who are in the program, of course Hispanic children and some white children and multiracial children. But we also see that when we look at the factors of free and reduced lunch, IEP, or McKinney-Vento, that we really have an overrepresentation of free and reduced lunch and McKinney-Vento in the program. So that's something that we're mindful of. And you have a district comparison there to kind of frame that work for you. And so what that means is, of course, we serve anybody who comes in the door. When you have, though, a small class size that has an overrepresentation of children with multiple and complex needs, that means that we've got to really be very thoughtful about how we're deploying our resources. So when we're talking about the MTSS process that usually is targeted at the lower fourth of your class, well, if half of your class is in the low quartile, that means you really have to be very strategic about what you're going to do. So this is one of the areas where Dr. Green and I have been talking about how she has some research on churn schools, and we're talking about they have some successes there, and we're going to be looking at ways that we can take advantage of what's to be learned there. There's a symposium in June that we'll be attending and learning more about that. The other challenge is the mobility. So you have a chart here that shows that over the life of the program, about a third of the children are new every year. So what that means is when you're constructing a program where you're where the ideology is cumulative, then children who were not there at the beginning of the program did not have the advantage of those inputs. So we just have to figure out how to navigate that. So that's just another one of our challenges. And then finally, the last thing is, of course, continuous enrollment. So we keep asking the question, well, how many years does a child have to be in ACC in order for us to feel like they've had the ACC experience? When you put on your researcher hat, you'd have to ask yourself, well, how many years participation would be reasonable if you wanted to draw any correlation between outcomes and participation in the program? So again, we are thankful that RED was able to pull this data, and they looked at what's happening with the 5th grade cohorts. And so there have been some students who had as few as 2 years of continuous enrollment, and some as many as 8 years. As many as 8 students with continuous enrollment, as is the case in this year. And then finally, we do want to, even though we have lots of different challenges in the program, we do have some bright lights and some moments of success that we'd like to celebrate. So we did pull from the winter map. I think one of the classes just finished their spring map today, so we wanted to provide, just from the winter map data, a sense of how many students were on track for college and career readiness who are in the high average or high section of the map report. So I gave you the numbers there and the percents. The percents look really high because the class numbers are low. So I wanted to contextualize that for you, but we are excited that we do have some students who are on track for college and career readiness. And in addition to that, in the lower chart, this represents students whose percentile points have grown. So when I use the word significantly, I don't mean it in the research sense, but we just picked the point. We thought, since it was about 10 points every year, those who had more than 18 percentile point growth, we wanted to celebrate that. So some of these students may have started at the 3rd percentile, but if they grew to the 18th percentile, even though they're still in the lower quartile, we celebrate that because we know that that means that they are growing. So we just put those in there, and we gave you the time period over which they have grown. Some of these children were children who had multiple and complex situations, so we're really excited that their participation in the program is giving them this kind of growth. So finally, I want to talk about what we want to do moving forward. So we have 3 key recommendations. We want to, of course, talk about how do we enhance recruitment, how do we talk about stabilizing the flow of enrollment, and how do we attend to the program-specific professional learning and curriculum development. So we have done some things that we really are beginning to see some benefits. The ACC program has now been included in the Kindergarten Information Night presentations. Our communications officer has elevated the ACC program on the webpage. Even sometimes when you walk into the district door, you see it being mentioned, so this is just increasing awareness about it. We had an opportunity to introduce the program to JEH families, and our current president prepared a beautiful letter that she shared at the Oakton Kindergarten Information Night that I also shared excerpts from it at the district kindergarten night, and we do have a plan to videotape some of the comments that were made by parents so we can get a parent perspective about the program to help people understand why people choose and stay with ACC. In terms of stabilizing the enrollment, we got some feedback about how can we fast-track siblings where appropriate, just to make sure that they're getting in, and also establish some reasonable parameters on in-district transfers so that when children are coming in, that we're making sure that we're really being responsive to what's good for the children as well as what's going to be helpful in the program. Yes. And then finally, the program-specific professional learning. Again, I talked with Dr. Green, and we're talking about, since we have this representation of children with these dramatic needs, what other sources can we consider that have some success stories that will give us some additional insights that will complement the work that we're doing? So that is kind of an overview of what's in the memo, and so I want to give Dr. Allen and Dr. Osher a moment to add any comments.
Good evening, everyone. Well, good night, I should say. Right? There's really not much I think is important to highlight. I think Dr. Pitts was very thorough with the analysis of the memo. There's a lot of positive aspects that I've witnessed just in my first 8 months on the job at Oakton, and I'm very excited about the direction we're going. And I think there's a lot of behind-the-scenes work that we've started to, I would call grassroots efforts with Dr. Osher, Dr. Green, Dr. Pitts, and countless people at JEH with really trying to figure out a way to mobilize and prepare for what's coming next. And so I've been excited about recruitment efforts and parents reaching out. Our new task, Dr. Osher and I joke about that, is like we have about a meeting every other week with a group of 4 or 5 families, and most of them are interested in ACC. And we do a question and answer session, and we give them tours of the school, and we're able to really give them a real picture of what the experience is like for the program. So I've been very encouraged with the direction we're going, and I think it's positive to see some of the fruits of the labors that I know have been going out for a number of years.
I also agree. When you come to Oakton and you're a parent looking at a school at Oakton in the community, and you come to see Oakton, we don't show just one program. And even if they say, you know, my child might be in TWE or my child's going to be in Gen Ed, I don't need to see the other rooms. The experience is that you get to see all of the rooms, right, because we are all in one building and we are all Oakton. We just have different pathways that are housed in the school. But we do take them on tours, and it's very interesting to see their reactions. And just the sense of the feel that they get. The rooms all have different vibes for, you know, both all positive and reasons for, you know, strengths and challenges. But it is a sense when parents walk into an ACC room, it's a feel. So, you know, it's not that I can really describe it. I think if you haven't been there, we always have an open door policy, but it is that sense of community, and it's a sense of that cooperative learning, and the experience that we teach kids that, you know, again, through the program and Peter Morrell and all of the teachings through ACC, that we work as a group, and if one student isn't succeeding, then we all don't succeed. And so they do start to take on that experience, not only in the classroom, but throughout the school.
So we're open for questions that you may have.
Thank you. Questions? Anya,
thank you all. I just wanted to highlight what I think is a additional strength that I would love to hear more from you all about, which is at a parent meeting, it was highlighted by one of our ACC teachers how the collaborative spirit of learning that is the pedagogical, I guess, technique for working with children extends to how adults work with one another. Yes. To view every child's success as the goal. And I'm just curious to learn more about what that looks like in terms of how educators are given the opportunity to plan or work with one another, support one another, and what learnings may be there for all of our teams.
All right, so there are multiple answers to that question. The ACC teachers do a lot of volunteering of their time. Many times, we meet twice a month on Wednesdays, and generally, a large focus of that is to plan our morning routine because we collectively implement the morning routine, but we also have professional learning that we need to do. So we have to carve out spaces and time. Sometimes there's a stipend associated with that. Sometimes it's volunteer. Sometimes teachers are stipended to come in the summer. We had several day-long sessions or half-day sessions in June last year as we were all collectively investigating the concepts that we were going to be teaching this year. Because you have to remember that many of us were also educated in the public schools, and we did not have the advantage of learning in an ACC program. So we are still involved in the learning process as well. So much of I had never heard of the Rosenwald schools before we started studying that this year. So there's a lot of learning that we have to do. We learn the content, and then we have to figure out how do we invite students into this space in ways that are going to build their knowledge. It's not just telling them things, but are helping them construct understandings. So yeah, carving out spaces and time for professional learning is one of the challenges that we're negotiating.
I have a question regarding the McKinney-Vento. Why is it that number is so significant for ACC?
It's actually significant in ACC and in Oakton in general. So you want to?
I would say, I don't know why yet, but I do know that it is significant. It's a school-wide trend, though. It's not just an ACC trend. The numbers are definitely disproportionately high at Oakton compared to other schools in the district. I haven't quite honed in on why, but it is certainly reflected in the program as well.
In our program, when we had a lower enrollment, we had a very dedicated staff member who was connected with McKinney-Vento families who would always offer the program, and many times they would say yes. And so because we had low enrollment, we received them, and so I think that has contributed significantly to why it's at such a disproportionate number. But it is significant to know that the disproportionality is in Oakton overall as well as in the program.
And I think just with that, to piggyback on that, that also comes with a higher need, with a need for additional resources, because many of those kids come in, not that other schools don't have it as well, but with high trauma needs, and it's compounded also in classrooms at a higher level. So therefore, those needs need to be addressed before actually learning can take place. And so our teachers do a really good job with that as the program, because the program is fostered in a way to address some of those needs in the classroom with a morning routine also as a whole, but also the circles and so forth that were talked about before that. That's been going on since for the program for way before we started doing it as a district. And so really, how do we build classroom community? But I do want to highlight that doesn't make it any easier, right? So therefore, even though a classroom might only have 14 kids, when you have high trauma needs, that 14 might feel like 30, right? And so I just want to also just kind of address that and put that out there, because that is a significant large number when we start to look at it in comparison to other schools throughout the district.
Right, but so I say that because it is a high need population, and so I feel like that's adding additional stress to a school that already is dealing with, with just schools with significant needs, and they could go to any school, correct? But the choice is to put them in a school that it seems is already stressed with the children that maybe could be better served in a school that doesn't have that level of stress. I don't know.
It's an interesting balance to try to navigate, because sometimes families who have needs want to seek out an ACC program because of the sense of community and the sense of support that is there. So we have to make sure that we are balancing the student enrollment in ways so that the integrity of the program is there, so that you actually have that cushion of support that needs to surround families who are challenged. And so when you talked about the learning, the extra learning is, how can we learn from this structure about what we can do in other places to make sure that we're providing that kind of community support? We have the teachers are connected in the community. I mean, just the access to resources are leveraged through that sense of family that is just throughout all members of the program.
And I gotta say that makes sense, because again, having the smaller class sizes, given that there's these, you have families that are dealing with a lot of these traumas, that by design, in and of itself, I think that lends itself, and like you're saying, if the staffing, again, and the folks that are staffing this particular program are collectively working together, I mean, the children and the families are gonna see the benefit of this. And again, we had a couple of parents testify to the benefits, right? And this knowledge that most kids won't know. So then my question is going to be, goes back to, going back to the agreement that was made back in the mission statement, right? For the ACC program, which talked about our larger efforts, right? In regards to curriculum and ensuring that African American achievement. Again, this was something that was done back in 2005, and one of the things I've asked, and I think a couple of board members have asked this before, is can we take some of these wonderful project explorations, cultural explorations, and integrate it into our district-wide social studies curriculum. So that might be a question for Stacy there, but
I'm a social studies person too, so.
Right, so then something, I really do want to, but I don't want to dilute the program either. So I think that's a concern. Again, you don't want to dilute something that's very powerful. But there are powerful elements, I think, that really speak to our larger vision around equity and about and the windows and mirrors concept of multiculturalism, where we want our children to learn about others, but also see themselves reflected. So to me, I think there's elements I think that can be shared district-wide through our social studies curriculum. And I know we cycle it. We'll do a couple of months, a couple of weeks we'll do science, we'll do math, we'll do then we'll do social studies. It's just the nature of how it is, but if we can find a way to get some of those experiences.
So I will say that we had a meeting with Megan Bang this morning. We're talking about the representation of Indigenous people in our social studies curriculum. And you may remember from, I think, was that August of this year? I can't remember. The time is just moving. Where we had the presentations from parents from all people. Right. So we have taken that work very seriously, and it is moving. We're not ready to talk about all the details, but that's certainly our learnings that we are, and have made some new connections about ways that we can really enrich what's happening in the social studies, but we'll talk about it on another day.
I also just wanted to highlight a couple of things that you touched upon. It was interesting when I went from Chute to Oakton, and when I got to Oakton, we decided to go back and do a study and go back down to Chute and ask and do focus groups and ask students, about their experiences, and just to gather some data to see, how could we benefit students as they move along, and some of the things that they wish they could have moving forward, because our McKinney-Vento students then become Chute's McKinney-Vento students if they don't move in and out of the district. And so thinking about, being collaborative with the middle school as well, because it's just not like after they leave 5th grade that all of these, things happen and everybody's great, right? They get compounded as in going into middle school with adolescents on top of it, and everything a middle school environment brings. But the one thing that I will say is that they do highlight is the experiences that they've had, right? In the sense of that community and wishing, for that community. And they are a tight-knit group, right? So they've been together, especially the ones that have, been in the program for so long. It's just, when I'm thinking, and I don't want to be selfish on everything that Oakton needs, but as our students even go to middle school, whether it's Chute or it's Nichols or wherever else they go, is thinking about, ways that we could still support them with the learned knowledge and the things that they have been given while at ACC.
If I may, just a half step back, Dr. Pitts sits at a wonderful intersection of our work on the ACC on culturally relevant pedagogy and on social studies. And so working with Dr. Green and Dr. Beardsley and thinking about it. And so I appreciate the comment, but it's your leadership around building a district infrastructure that then benefits from what we learn at Oakton, and as we think about spreading it, is really an important piece.
Yeah, I will say that because of the work I had done in ACC, when we started taking up culturally responsive pedagogy, I kind of had a running start. So we have already benefited as a district because of the ways that we share as team members.
So I just want to go back to this student growth chart. These are really exciting numbers. The trajectory of growth is so important, and also the time period is encouraging that demonstrates children sustaining a trajectory of growth, and in particular, if these are students that were not originally performing at their college and career readiness benchmarks, then this trajectory of growth is really important in terms of demonstrating a capacity to accelerate growth over time. And I think that based on all of the discussions that we've had, this is what we need, right? This is something that we need to see replicated. So we have the talent, we have the expertise, we have the model in-house. How are we spreading that learn? I mean, I appreciate that it may have come through culturally responsive teaching in the brain, but
So let me also contextualize this a little bit. This is where the kind of research question has to come up. How can we be sure to what degree the program has contributed to these results? So we celebrate them, but I don't want to draw correlations that are not necessarily supported by some parameters. But we wanted to celebrate what we're seeing. At the same time, we're asking these other questions to help us know, what are the puts and takes that are going to give us the insights about where we need to expand our work.
And I appreciate your humility, though last year we also had some really affirming data that came out of ACC that indicated that Black students were doing, in ACC were doing better than Black students district-wide. And we may not be able to name and identify what the exact correlating factor is, but I think what we're hearing from families, what we're seeing in these numbers is indicative that there's something really amazing happening. And I think what we're also hearing from some of our other families is that they would like some of this amazing experience. And so the question is, if we have some knowledge, right, how do we spread that good word to everyone?
I'm receiving what you're saying very guardedly, because I think one of the things that we have a lot of confidence about is this idea of this collectivism really works. Well, and John Hattie's work tells us that collective teacher efficacy is the thing that can really accelerate student learning. So using that knowledge, that's one of the practices that we have in the program, teachers working together, looking at groups of students over time. That's one of the insights that we have. So I think we're looking at how we're leveraging that in our design for professional learning as a district. So these are some of the ways that we're trying to build on what we're learning. But we're still in the process of learning. What is this program? What do we do that's different? And again, how do we make some correlations between what is different that is contributing to success? That's something we're still teasing out.
So other things I've noticed that speaks to that question is the program is designed structurally to where teachers know on day one that they're making a larger commitment than other teachers. So their folks are given their planning time to not only meet for vertical alignment, but they're actually going into each other's classroom, and it's a part of the unconscious commitment that I don't know structurally we have a foundation for even at Oakton. So we're pushing Dr. Ocean in our meeting about, okay, how do we push this same mentality or the same approach to education building wide? Because technically we have a contract that doesn't really directly speak to that. But ACC teachers unconsciously assume that on day one. So they're okay with meeting for 3 and 4 hours after school twice a month at a minimum. And then they sometimes will meet themselves without that. And that same approach, even from a discipline standpoint, they're usually informing us about what's going on just so we know. But the student's not coming down with the intent for us to handle that situation. It's just more of a, hey, we want you to know this happened, just in case a parent reaches out or just so you know. But that mentality is what we're trying to figure out even how to replicate at Oakton. And I don't know if it'd be fair to say that there's a direct correlation. We're careful about saying that because we're not constrained. That's my impression at Oakton the first year, is that there's something that's going on in the program that's part of its expertise. Some of it's the program design, some of it's the unconscious mentality that teachers know that they're committing to in that program. And so I think you have to be careful about understanding those different pieces before you look at what it could look like to replicate it district-wide. Does that make sense?
I'll also say that I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all. Like, it's not a checklist. If you do A, B, and C, it's going to work in your classroom on the other side of town or wherever you are, right? I just think, one, it's really the investment piece, and it's really the sense of being constant learners, right? And talking about practice and getting together and looking at data and what's informing that, right? And what can we do differently? Because we can't continue to do the same thing and expect that something is going to happen. So if it didn't happen the first time, we're not going to wait 3 months down the road and figure it out then, right? What can we do now? And so what I've noticed, and I'm sure Dr. Allen, Dr. Pitts can speak to as well, it's that constant, conversation, whether it's 3, 4, and 5 together in K1 and 2, and then they piggyback K1, 2, 3, 4, 5 together in the morning. So sometimes they meet as whole groups, as all grades, and then they kind of pick 2 grades at a time, right? So they feel very comfortable on talking about, hey, what do you have, because this isn't working, or can I send you a kid, they're having a hard time today, you had them last year, or you know what, you're gonna have them next year, so I wanna send them up, and kind of that flex kind of grouping, and not only for academics, but just for that social emotional piece, or just because, you know what, you might have a better rapport, and I'm still working at it. So I don't know if it is a textbook answer, but what I do know, it's the investment, it's that mindset of, let's do something differently and let's have a little autonomy to do some things differently, and then going with it and looking at it and reflecting, to add, remove, and enhance. If it's not working, then okay, what's next? And that kind of mentality.
Thank you.
So while I appreciate that, your humility and the caution, I do feel a little bit like over the years, because we've gotten these ACC updates, and we get really positive and exciting information, and as a board, we're eager to know how we can expand that district-wide. So there's a little bit of a disconnect that I'm feeling of, we're saying on the one hand, there's a district, we support this program, and we believe that there's a lot of, and you're reporting out some really positive things, but then the hesitation to just really allow, particularly these educators in ACC who I know are putting in an enormous amount of time and expertise in building this program. So there's a little bit of a disconnect for me, if I'm honest, from hearing that hesitation of let's move some of these teachings district-wide. Let's even consider opening up another ACC strand somewhere else, because I know too from the original program design, it was never intended to be one strand housed at one school. So I appreciate the caution, but I have to just call it, I feel like I've been hearing it year after year after year. So at some point, I do hope that we can really think more intentionally about how we're going to expand some of the good things that we know are happening in this program to all classrooms district-wide, but even expanding the program to other schools in the district, I think is an important thing. One other thing from the report, there was in more intentionally attending to program and curriculum design, there's a comment. Educators require opportunities to learn, apply, and receive feedback in the process of enacting the pedagogy. This may require reallocating existing resources in ways that support the program design. Just wondering if you could expand on that a little bit more about what you mean by that and how.
Right, because this African-centered pedagogy with the 5 essential practices is something that we need to explore so that we can build more confidence in our implementation of it, that is the secret juice, so to speak, of the program design. So we're in the process of learning that. So we have to figure out, okay, when is that learning going to happen? Because once a month after school isn't really sufficient to build the kind of confidence in implementing the pedagogy that makes us just more secure in it. So that's what we're going to be looking to do.
Okay.
I think it's just also difficult because our teachers, also have to be responsible to also go to all the other PDs, which are just as important, right? And so how do we have that balance, right? And being able to implement both and without, again, self-care for our teachers, just because also working with a needy population, which is high stress, not only for students, but for teachers and social workers and psychologists, everybody who is all hands on deck. We could have our schedule laid out for the day, and none of that gets done if something else takes precedence. And so when there's a student or a teacher that needs something, then, that takes precedence. And so just thinking about, how do we do this balancing act and being able to support our teachers with, everything else that's on their plate and being able to, help them be thought partners in that, whether it's sitting and helping them plan. I don't like to always call it extra, but often it is. But how do we then embed things and compound it together so that it doesn't feel so overwhelming?
I'm curious, do other school leaders have the opportunity to learn about how ACC is run and what ACC looks like or feels like?
We haven't done anything like that recently, no. It's an interesting question.
Oh, I was kind of just going to piggyback, Cindy, on what you said, because I was really struck, and I highlighted it on page 8 of the report under program pedagogy, the discussion, the quotes from or reference to Morell's work. And I think if I were to assert something that from a replication of that should be embedded in everything we have in terms of an approach to pedagogy, asserting that teachers that are accomplished, teachers of African American children or any other children are viewing that activity as a joint activity and that they're successful when children have learned, not when children have been taught.
Right.
That was, it's so obvious, but yet so penetrating, when you think of it. Like, what does it take to have that? And I'm not saying that it isn't in many places in our school district, but that seems to be the a core of what should be proliferated across the district. And it may take extra resources and time. And then to your point of having that student-centered learning be the focus, you need to have data and you need to be looking at it, which kind of dovetails with our next conversation. And all these things take capacity building and time, but how do you actually permeate that throughout a system?
Yeah, there's really a relationship piece there. Of course, I can't put the whole book in there, but this idea, this is one of the things that we're really honing in and one of the discussions that we're having in the program. This relationship of, yes, the teacher can't say, I taught it, they didn't learn it, but also we have to build in the student the ownership. I have a responsibility to be a learner. I'm not just here chilling, hoping I'm gonna catch something on the fly, right? I need to be as invested in the work. I need to be responsible. So these are some of the features that are as important as the content. And so when we talk about what is in the program design, all of these are the elements. So when we talk about the continuity of a child participating, this is something that you build in children over time. You can't just like come in, you were in here 6 weeks and you just get it, right? So this is one of the things that we are intentionally seeking to understand more, because some of our children who people would say, oh, you know, they don't have multiple and complex needs. Yet, when they present to us, they are not committed to their own learning. So we have to work with those individuals also and say, we need you to understand what your commitment is as a learner. So that's, again, but this is part of the ideology of the program, so it's something we do very intentionally.
One of the things that's been mentioned and I'm wondering about, or just, I know that this year, Stacy and Jamila, you've led some of the work in terms of culturally relevant practices. And so expanding that. So while there hasn't necessarily been for principals a visit to Oakton specifically, part of the school climate trajectory means moving from relationships to safety to then a focus on really moving towards culturally relevant pedagogy. While those aren't directly synonymous in terms of the ACC program, many of the practices and some of the lessons learned are, the vision is for expansion, isn't simply. So while we haven't had a formal visit, there has been a commitment to move towards expanding the vision. Now, I do think there's an opportunity for us to examine, to think about even deeper engagement around the African-centered principles that are emerging there. And I think that there are certain rituals and routines that are relevant. But again, you have to think about site. So replication has to be very carefully thought through. And I think your assessment has been right on point, which is that school change isn't even in the best models, which is why our national model, there isn't a national model, is that it does take a lot of thinking through some of the key components that require for a successful change process. The individuals at the school, the motivation, some of the key factors you've already mentioned. And also as a school district, we are, I think there are the growth, the conditional growth that we saw at Oakton. We see similar practice, see similar trends in other schools. Oakton has had some of that acceleration, but we also see some other places. So really isolating, I think, is very wise in thinking through that.
I think just as a note too, we, as far as our ACC program at Oakton, we have space and availability in all of our classes. And so that's been part of the work to get the word out about ACC program this year and to improve some of the communications pieces. And so it is to take conversations like this and to spread knowledge of the practices and the work in the ACC program elsewhere so that we can be servicing more kids within the existing strand of ACC at Oakton. And then there really are multiple pathways. One, we want to maximize the impact of our current program. Two, we want to better understand the learning and the happenings that are within that program. We can make connections to our culturally responsive pedagogy, and there's some very intentional connections already. And we can potentially think about over time whether that expansion in itself is the right thing to do based on demand for the program, and or the strengthening of our culturally responsive pedagogy across programs throughout the district. And that connection of learning, because it can be in the principles or in the program, or both.
And I think we're at a very important moment. We have, as you can see, very solid and dedicated leadership that, if I may, isn't in conflict. You're working together to make a difference. We've got a district-wide initiative around culturally relevant pedagogy and practices that then is informed by our ACC work, and the ACC work is informed by it. And we've got a commitment of all of us around our racial equity work. And so the moment to actually start to pursue even more so the question of what does scale really mean, what is spreading practices, what is sharing the practices with your colleagues, is even more ripe now than perhaps the last couple of years. And so I think we have to take these questions and figure out how to do it and act on that. And I mean, I'd be remiss to not thank the parents who came tonight. The important messages of the power of this for children, your children, and the power, if I may, for you to watch as your children go through. I think we're at that pivot point. And again, we've been at pivot points before, and we've sort of bumped along. And the first 6, 7 years, we bumped along. And under the 5 years that I've been here, we've had moments where there's been enthusiasm and moments where there's been sort of silence. And I feel a moment of enthusiasm now. And so then it behooves us and me to take the next step.
And I would just like to say, like, I feel a little frustration that we've had these conversations, I feel like every year, and like every year I feel like we're being reintroduced to ACC and how amazing it is. And I'm here still feeling like we don't have a plan 3 to 5 years from now and what success looks like for ACC. I know it's a great program, and every year we talk about how can we take pieces of it and implement it throughout our school district. And so, I've only been on this board for 2 years, and I know that it's been part of the conversation for the last 2 years. Prior to that, it's been part of the conversation, several years. So I think to honor the families, to honor the teachers and all their dedication and, all the effort that's poured into their work, I would love to see that work honored in a 3-5-year plan. Also, I would love to see a connection with our TWE program. I think we'd be remiss to honor the Afro-Latino identity that we have as a potential collaboration at Oakton. And I think we always talk about these two programs in isolation, and it's something that I brought up at our discussion last year. We celebrate all the things that the teachers are doing right within these communities and all the successes that they're able to bring. But I'm leaving here without a sense of where we hope to be with this program next year, or in 3 years, or in 5 years, and how we do honor their work and all their efforts that they're putting in, and honor the voices of the parents that are saying, this program is working for our kids. And while at the same time seeing other kids in our school district who look just like those students, who aren't seeing those successes, who aren't feeling like they're, that like they belong. So I hear you in feeling that it's going in the right direction and honoring the work that's taking place right now. But I would really love to see something that shows us, that gives us something to celebrate in 3 years, in 5 years, and how we're honoring the work of ACC. And so we're not here next year having the same conversation. So just wanted to put that out there.
Well, I guess I think some of the challenges, just talking to each other, is to Stacy's point, we're in this catch-22 situation while there's these great successes, and yet there's a capacity, and maybe that is an issue of we don't have it in the right place, or we don't have it structured the right way that is more accessible across the district, because it is hard to replicate. It's hard to say, it would be hard to make a decision as a board, I would think, as a district to, I agree with, embedding into the rest of the district, but to open another strand when we aren't seeing enough demand in it. And the conversation about recruitment has been an ongoing conversation too. So I feel like we're in this catch-22 of there's, some very strong success, some of which a great deal of which is by the program design, some of which may be the size of classes as well, and the amazing dedication of the folks there. You pick up and add, it's very hard to make a decision to replicate that when you aren't at, and I'm not saying that full capacity would be the same as other average size classes, but if we're still having a challenge in terms of recruiting, how do we get over that hump? Because clearly we're not imparting this benefit, or there are other hurdles, and that may be place, maybe it's place and distance, and how do you experiment with that? How do you experiment with that in a setting so that you can find out whether it is really place and distance that's the barrier more so than information sharing or not? Because for me, that's the conundrum.
I agree with you, and I think
this isn't a conversation for now, but I would challenge us as a board. I don't think a single-strand ACC program housed at one Oakton school, no matter how successful it can be, can fill the void of, this is a community effort that is decades old of taking a school away from the Fifth Ward, and this is a much bigger conversation that needs a decades-long solution too. And I feel like that's just some of the baggage that's around this topic. How do we educate our students of color? How do we empower and support identity development and provide an academically rich setting? You know, one strand isn't where the bang for buck is, right? It's it has to be about reaching the entirety of the community, and I definitely don't want that on your backs. Although you're doing great work and I love the updates, but I think that's a conversation for this board and a longer term vision planning around what do we want for the district, and how do we talk about this one strand at a time, or do we talk about this in a much broader context of institutional change? And I look forward to that conversation, because I'm going to stop because we can't have it now.
I would say it is worth the bang for the buck for the kids who are in the program, right?
Absolutely.
And the families that are in the program, that notwithstanding, that, but to the leverage point,
Yeah.
and yet we're still not getting, you know,
I think it's challenging because I think, you know, there's years of the program, you know, from implementation, not necessarily being supported, that we are fighting up against. And I think also, you know, like when we think about TWE, which I understand is a very different program, and so it's not exactly comparable, but we do make an effort to have it in locations where people can access it and still maybe have a chance to go at or near their neighborhood school, and yet we're not affording that same opportunity to a program like ACC. So while I understand we can say, well, this isn't at capacity, I'm not sure that this strand not being at full capacity is indicative of a lack of interest in the program. If it were housed at other places, you know, as a district that for the most part is very organized around neighborhood schools, it can be challenging to have one program in just one school and then wonder why, well, but nobody's going to the program in that school. Like I'm not saying there are easy solutions. I'm not saying we should just, you know, without further discussion, just opening up another strand, but I think it's worth exploring as we're thinking about, you know, enhancing recruitment, as we're thinking about how do we stabilize the population that there. It's worth thinking about is part of the problem that it's only at one school. So I think it's just a
jump in. I think also as we're talking about the importance of accelerating learning for Black students, we need to think creatively about how we utilize the knowledge that we have in-house to address that. And I think in terms of enrollment, one of the things we have to be honest about is that I think part of the initial lack of investment in lifting up and propping up ACC, and also some of the issues with enrollment, are related to anti-Black sentiments and folks not necessarily valuing an African-centered program. And part of us having these conversations is an opportunity to challenge those sentiments with content and with data, which is a very westernized sentiment of value, but here we are, and I think that there is benefit in that, but I think we have to be honest with ourselves that this lack of, or what, I don't know what the terminology would be for adequate enrollment or continuous enrollment is related in some ways, I think, to anti-Blackness. Excuse me. The other thing I wanted to mention is what I heard were some of the challenges is that there's really a culture and climate of doing ACC, and that is not something that you can package in a toolkit and just ship off and replicate. One of the things that I've experienced that are valuable in my work experience is when there is a program like that, part of the value is being able to visit those flagship programs and see and feel what it looks like to do that work. And so there's a community schools flagship school that existed. I don't know if it's still in New York, where folks could visit and you could go and talk to practitioners and you could find out what they do and how they do it and what's the impact, and you could see the work happening, and that in itself was an inspiration for folks. How do we go back? How do we work together? How do we work in our lanes and replicate this? You know, how do we find the funding? How do we write the programs, et cetera? And so I wonder if there is any potential for us to create something like that for teams from other schools to go and visit and say, okay, so there's supposed to be a secret sauce here. Can I just come and see y'all at work? That in itself may be an inspiration, or that may ignite questions that maybe y'all never thought about answering for people, right? Is there any capacity within our system to be able to provide opportunities like that and allow people to learn from each other in that way?
I think, interesting enough, we've always had, you know, kind of an open door policy, and we've had people come over. Actually, I know somebody, Dr. Allen is in SEED, and he's been talking with a teacher in another school, and she's had some interest in coming over and just kind of seeing, you know, what it feels like. I think also it almost reminds me of, you know, setting a condition, right? We can't tell you exactly how to do it, but we can set some conditions, right? Some things that that we do that you can implement, right? I think also, but we have to be careful because everybody has a different style, right? And so it's almost like taking a teaching class, right? So you can learn all the textbook philosophies you want, but that might not save you if you're standing in front of a group of middle schoolers. I learned that the hard way, right? If you're not if you don't have some tricks up your sleeve, right? And how to form relationships and deal with students and have those connections. So there are some, you know, go-tos, but I just don't think it will be a textbook answer to that. I just think, you know, setting your conditions to be an environment which is nurturing, right? Well, there is not one way to do that. People have a different style. So I think some of those things, but definitely, you know, seeing it seeing it hands-on, I think is a start. But I think there is much more that needs, it's the onion peel, right? To keep peeling it back in the investment in learning about it.
I want to add one more thing to your point about our relationship with the TWE program and Afro-Latinas. I think we have come to a new and more positive relationship with our TWE colleagues. So there is some more collegial learning that's happening there. We have Afro-Caribbean people in the program, so we are giving more attention to that. We don't always necessarily talk about it, but yeah, those are multiple inputs that we're kind of considering and navigating. So that is, it's very encouraging that we have, I would say, have healed our relationship in some ways because it wasn't always as positive as it is now. So I'm really encouraged by that.
And is that, again, are you talking district-wide or just at Oak? Because I think
both, actually both.
Yeah,
actually
because
both.
yeah, really, again, there is, and I'm really glad that you mentioned that there is this tension, right, between Black and Brown communities that I think we really need to address. Part of it is, again, because of internalized white supremacy that we have, but I'm glad that at least that we're starting to go down that path, because I really think that's a conversation that needs to happen in regards to us moving forward. So that's I'm very glad to hear that. No, I think, yeah.
Because I think if we took a poll of our biracial children in Evanston, my daughter was an ACC, and the reason why she was an ACC is because there's certain aspects about her her blackness that I couldn't teach her. You know, and I think if you are able to capture those families and explain to them the value, like it was explained to me when I was, you know, going to schools and seeing where the best fit would be for my daughter. I think there is that community is here, and I think that what better program to offer that identity than ACC. Not to mention that there's so much overlap between those two communities, and I think that what better way to bridge you know, bridge those two communities in understanding that I know happens in ACC.
And I'll just add an anecdotal experience as well. I, hands down, would have selected ACC for my daughter if it was not so far from our house. I wish that we had a closer option. So anecdotally, I think, yeah, definitely location can make a difference for families. It just felt like a big distance for a kindergartner with a newborn sister.
I want to say something, and I say this in a couple ways. This is not, Anya, in all response to what you just said, because I appreciate that. I'm a Oakton parent as well from the years past, and one of the elephants in the room is that people in this district avoid Oakton. And Oakton is a spectacular place. You can see it by the leaders here. You can see it by the parent community that's sitting behind me. And so, again, not at all in response to what you just said, but there is also the piece, and I'm just so pleased that Melissa Messenger, our communications director, has been engaging in highly sophisticated, Fred Ortiz did some work too, and in the recruiting. But there's the elephant in the room in Evanston, as we think about Evanston schools in the future, is also to take the gem that is Oakton and celebrate it. And again, I'm maybe half of my superintendent's hat is off, and half of my parents' hat is on, because that's my neighborhood as well. And it's such a spectacular place. There's fabulous educators there. There's a parent community that's devoted to the school. And so again, how to make it even a better school than it is already good.
And I should say, Paul, after I got on the board a couple months later, you and I haven't visited many schools, but one of the first school I asked to visit with you was Oakton. And it's not at all as advertised in, the world, and there's, it gets a bum rap, and you're right, we walked through it. We saw tremendous learning in the classrooms. We saw kids engaged, smiling, just like any other place, right? And it's something that needs to be nullified in the community, because it's not a rap that's deserved. And I'm not an Oakton parent, so saying that.
I would add that when we hosted the last 4 families, we did ask them, well, how did you hear about Oakton? Like, what brought you? And they said in a parent group that there was lots of positive comments. So that is new. That is new, because we know that the history of Oakton is it has not always enjoyed as positive a reputation as it has deserved. So we are excited to know that there's a positive buzz going on out there, and that we are now the beneficiaries of that. So that's a good
So
thing.
you're speaking to the power of parent engagement, right?
Yes.
Which I always think
Parent communication.
we really need to, continue to,
Yeah.
again, I think we're starting to get better at it. We still got a lot of work to do in regards to informing parents about all of the opportunities that are available for all our students and all families. At the same time, going back to the bad rap, the bad rap, again, isn't, we need to trumpet what we do really well. But at the same time, we need to work with the folks who are doing real estate, because they're the ones who are, they're the ones who are out there telling folks about this,
Right.
And you go to the websites about great schools, and, again, there's folks who, so it isn't just our responsibility, we need to reach out to some of these folks who are advertising on behalf of the city, who are real estate folks, work with the city of Evanston to really talk about, again, some of these issues that we're dealing with, that again, that all of Evanston has this incredible diversity, economic as well as, as cultural and race. But again, it's part of that. This is a result of these larger structural issues that the community's been dealing with for a while. So a lot of times we kind of try to blame ourselves as a school district, but there's larger structural issues and institutional partners that need to kind of step in as well to help us get over these issues.
And we're seeing signs of it, though. 2 of the families, one was from Maryland, one was from maybe Ohio, and they were actually meeting with the realist. They were going to see properties after they left the meeting with us at Oakton, so it was a part of their process. So that was very encouraging to see folks who were actively looking to come to Oakton, and they haven't even moved to Evanston yet. So that was productive.
That is fantastic to hear, and Oakton deserves all the accolades that it's getting, and deserves to have a better reputation within our district, and so I'm glad to see that maybe it's starting to get the recognition that it's due. So thank you very much, all of you,
Thank you.
for the presentation and for your work. Now we will move on to our final discussion topic, the use of mid-year assessments for school improvement. Anjali?
So,
She just said that.
okay. You have 12 minutes.
She'll be right back. 12 minutes?
You just pause for Dr. Green to come back.
Yeah.
Oh, did that really step up?
Water, anybody?
Throw water. I'm just saying, there was an 11-page memo. Thank you much. Let me start off, and then I'll turn over to Dr. Green and Dr. Kelgati. I think one way to help to frame this memo is to think about our student performance over time and many of the outcomes that we talk about around this table, and then talk about some of the activities that we've done and some of the initiatives we've taken over the last couple of years to actually address student performance and student success. So one of those pieces is that we invested in position and in work on Black student success, and that's what Dr. LaTarsha Green is working on with colleagues and with all of us in the district. The second thing we've done, and we've had a presentation before the board on our MTSS system, the multi-tier systems of support, which is a good, an excellent way of using data to try to make a difference in instructional practices and in addressing concerns and needs for kids. And we've invested in a new and a usable tool in that way. We also, this year, changed the flow of information from what we've done in the past. In the past, the mid-year formative assessments were not required. They were voluntary. So if a school wanted to take on the mid-year MAP assessments, they could. And if they didn't want to, they didn't have to. And we actually changed that this year. And we changed that this year to be able to get a formative snapshot assessment. So rather than looking only at the beginning of the year and then looking at the end of the year, and we're getting towards the end of the year now, and then thinking about how do we do school improvement planning so we get ready for the following year, we actually implemented a required MAP assessment as a formative assessment, not summative. These aren't the final scores, they're the final grades. They're the way to look at where we are, to make some mid-course corrections, and to actually inform the planning process for the following year at an earlier stage. And so what we've done in this memo is provided both some of the approaches that we have to how do we approach formative assessment data at the school level, and how do we think about that in terms of the whole cycle of continuous improvement. With that, I'm going to turn to Dr. Kelgati and Dr. Green, who will give you some sense of how we approach this work and how we approach the use of these data, and then we'll open it up for questions.
So in terms of one of the things that we did in November of this past year, and you saw in the memo, so a lot of what we covered is in the memo, but what I wanted to highlight are a couple things. We substantively really recognized that there was a need for greater support for our school leaders and in the system to really increase the level of understanding around using the MAP data on a much more formative level at this midwinter point. Our schools used it to develop their school work plans and to develop their course for the year. However, as a course correction or because it's a dipstick, right? So a midwinter MAP test is not even with drops in scores, you're going to use it as an opportunity to then look at formative assessment and then to really get data conversations happening with your teachers, using your SIT team to change some, maybe look at their plans for the year and make some adjustments. And so I recognize in my role of supporting principals that there was a need, and in feedback I got from Dr. Beardsley and from Kylie and working with Stacy, we really recognized that there was a need to increase the amount of understanding, and number two, to spend time getting principals more familiar with the tool. MAP is constantly changing their resources, and so we made that decision, and we provided through Jari White, who is the instructional coach under Dr. Green for Black Student Success, and Donna Cross, who's working with multi-tiered systems of support. We developed a workshop in late January, followed by a second workshop that Dr. Green and I provided to principals as really an acceleration of beginning to think about how do we do formative assessment as a result. And it was important for us to provide that resource. Now, principals are at a range. I would not say that they're all in the same place around using this data tool. However, overall, we saw that there was a definite need to begin that. And so, particularly when we see that our scores in the spring around MAP score, last spring, there was a real need to address that. And so our plans focused on those. Particularly, all of our schools had a focus on Black students, particularly around equity. We use a racial equity impact assessment tool in the development of schoolwork plans. So that was some of the learning that principals went through last year. However, we didn't feel, as we looked at the schoolwork plans, this is how we came to the decision around the workshops. When we looked at the schoolwork plans, we really felt like there was a knowledge gap, and there was a need to really support our principals much more from our end. And so that's what we engaged in. And did you want to jump in?
Sure. I think it's important first for me to just note and share a disclaimer that for me, student achievement and performance largely comes from standardized data. I get somewhat of a mixed understanding of how we look at data or need additional data, but we don't want to over-assess kids, or some assessments don't matter. So I'm just putting that disclaimer out there that for me, the objective nature of a standardized summative assessment or an assessment like MAP, which is largely used for diagnostic and instructional purposes, is a leverage that you can use to really help change instructional practice and even make the notation of what those changes need to be. In my experience, and largely informed by Paul Bambrick's work with leveraged leadership and driven by data, the achievement gap or attacking the achievement gap is largely done through data-informed practices. So giving a test is one part of that piece. It is the information that comes afterwards and what's done with that information. And so largely what Andalip mentioned, we wanted to make sure that principals were not only looking and monitoring that data, but they were using it as a leverage, as a talking point to help inform some adaptive conversations with staff. And so quite practically, we gave some examples of some different ways to leverage that information, some ways to be very strategic in targeting conversations with classroom teachers about specific groups of students and their achievement. So again, for me, this information from the winter assessment provided a great midpoint opportunity for principals to kind of get back in tune with. A lot of our work is focused on evaluations, formal, and et cetera, but it allows you to kind of get in informally and understand some of the practice that happens within the classroom that informs how children will perform on assessments. So I just want to say that there are research is pretty specific around things that need to be happening and in place on a consistent basis. In my mind, it relates to teachers' knowledge of students and what they know about a student's misconceptions so that they can teach to that. In my previous experiences, that to me is the, that's the hallmark of
culturally relevant pedagogy. How well do I know my students, and what is it that they understand or don't yet understand? And how teachers leverage that information and what they do about it in service and support of learning standards and curricular resources is where the rubber meets the road. So this opportunity to look at mid-year data from a benchmark standpoint of determining what practices we should continue, which things that goals were established from are not yet netting the kind of results we want to see, and what are some things that we might need to start doing is part of what this practice was to help introduce for our leaders. And Andalib referenced principals, but originally our conversation looks at all of the leaders of learning in a building, which can be inclusive of coaches, lead teachers, the school improvement teams membership. And we wanted to make sure that the data literacy was consistent, because from my understanding, there's been various aspects of knowledge around how to leverage certain reports from the NWEA and other assessments. And so these are technical things, but they're critical to helping start the conversation up on the part that is the adaptive part of this work, right? So what I know about my practice and what I know about my students is something that teachers bring uniquely into the conversation. The collectivism of us approaching the problem of why a child isn't yet mastering curriculum is something that needs to be leveraged by a shared discussion. And so what we've seen in a couple of instances, I'll speak for myself, what I've seen in a couple of instances is building leaders as well as teachers' level of comfortability in doing that seems to vary. And so this was our attempt at trying to standardize a practice that will absolutely help launch planning moving forward, but also provides some guidance in what can happen from January to May before another assessment is given and taken. So.
Oh, questions?
Thank you both. It impresses me that this is something that has to be part of our DNA as a district, and it doesn't mean, and I guess to your point, Dr. Green, I've grappled too with, I feel like in some ways, and this is as much us as it also is our community, that we're kind of half pregnant on whether we think data is good or bad to use with instruction. And I don't think we can be half pregnant on this. I'm not good with the sports metaphor, so I could use the pregnancy metaphor. I think we have to come down and have one voice as a board on how we are going to, have a policy around communication with parents. And because I've been unfortunately in this district now for a long time, I have seen ups and downs of whether we communicate scores, what we communicate about it, how we communicate about it. Clearly, we've seen that feedback from the folks at the King Arts parents. So there's a holistic piece around this, and I feel like we've shied away from it, or we've backed away from it, and somehow we have to create that vision of being, in my mind, being student-centered does mean that you have to understand, to your question around, your point around knowledge, you have to understand where we're falling down. And it's not, my daughter's fourth grade teacher before her MAP test said, this is not a test of you, this is a test of me. And I feel like that's what we should be talking about, but I don't feel like it's in our DNA right now.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that what I've observed is by requesting holistic views around student achievement, like ideally I support that belief, but I center my work around college and career opportunities for children post-secondary. And until the larger system embraces that as an adequate measure of who a child is, I feel like it's my moral imperative to make sure that under the constraints that are given, we are providing teachers and students the opportunity to be critical consumers and show their best selves in terms of what they know and what they have learned. So I too wonder what's the delicate dance with that, because quite frankly and somewhat flippantly, I can't get into Harvard with a portfolio, right? Like, so there is a point in time when, even if I want to get in the armed forces, there is an assessment that I need to take. This debate over teaching to the test, I taught in a generation of teaching to the test. It was called testing as a genre, was the unit of instruction, and it was all about test-taking skills. Now, I think that there is a transfer of learning that we have to be very strategic about for our students, particularly our students of color, Black students in particular. There's got to be ways that we can demonstrate what that learning looks like. And I don't believe that changing the bar for me, and I'll speak for myself and my household, is helping me. I think giving me adequate access and ability to that bar is where I'm at right now. I have some fundamental beliefs about why and how that needs to change because of institutional racism, but my balance is always, what are we doing right now for the child that is in 3rd grade who wants to get into the gifted and talented program but isn't yet at the 90th percentile? You know what I mean? So like, if I can't help address that very practical need for what achievement looks like, then I feel like it's somewhat of a failure on my part of what I know can happen. So I
guess my question to you all is, this is one of those, what, for me, and we as a board have to decide what it is collectively for us as a board, this is an area for me that's, what do we back burner? Because, you know, when Maria was here and Peter were here, there was some of this work was being done at the school level. It's certainly as part of our strategic plan, and it's important, and you're putting a new emphasis on it, but it's not, again, it's not something that's just gonna be a one-time, and you're shifting. A lot of folks haven't learned these ways of doing things, and it takes teachers time. So I have the questions of how do we, what do we have to do? What do we have to stop doing so that we can make space for this work, which I would say is one of the most important things we can do. When we look at successes, back to the previous discussion around ACC, we also, in talking through the successes at Oakton, to Dr. Allen's predecessor, Dr. Williams, a lot of that really was in focused work around data and understanding each child and where they were and working with each child. And I think that was part of the secret sauce there, as well as the others. So I just want to know what we have to do to make it successful. And then the second question is, do we need a communications policy or something? Do we need a more rigorous policy mechanism about how we communicate and how we make folks aware? Because I don't think we're doing a good job with our stakeholders right now of that, and what that engagement should look like with teachers, whatever.
I'm thinking about your questions, and I'm touched that you have the Illinois Performance Standards for School Leaders in here. It's wonderful. I know this document well. And you started with supporting the principals in this work. And Kylie, we had a conversation like a month ago around communication of this data and the reliance on your department for some of that. And I just feel like this is where school leaders have to carry the burden of storyteller for each building. And the uniqueness, we heard leaders from Oakton talking about how the data they chose to share with us tonight was powerful because it wouldn't necessarily show up on a graph if you showed up on who was doing well on the MEP test. That those kids made a lot of growth, but it wouldn't be represented in the way that we look at the data. But only they knew that. So they knew to pull it out to share it as a success. And I will repeat your question, is there a standardized way that this needs to happen, or who should do this? I would guess by the way you've presented this memo that you want to support the work of other people who are at each building to do this because they can do it best with their community and with their teachers. Is that not accurate?
We also, if we take tonight's conversation, we know that relationships matter and that the work on restorative practices is really important in a schoolhouse. We know that programs matter, ACC, other programs. And in this particular case, we also know that instruction matters and that we have to pivot instruction. If it's not working, we've got to do something about it. And we have to know how it's working. And the data provide us with how it's working. And then the question is, how do we work with the instructional leaders, who are typically the principal and the assistant principal in the building, and then their team, their school improvement team especially, to sort of move forward in that level of communication. Your question on what do we stop doing, because I just whipped off 3 things that also are data-driven. I mean, we're working on that as a cabinet to try to make headway into where do we keenly focus on the type of information that can drive the types of changes that will lead to better success for our kids. And that's again full circle to why we did the formative assessment. I mean, we wanted to have that dipstick rather than waiting till the end of the year.
I would like to very quickly thank both of you for these really insightful questions and comments. I think this is such essential work from my perspective. I agree with much of what my colleague over here has said tonight. I would say that when I go into the school buildings and I have a chance to dialogue with our school leaders around the professional practices that they are using, they are employing world-class, incredible practices in their schools, things that I have seen that are pretty stupendous and are very impressive. And I've seen a lot of research literature. I'm very aware of what kind of best practices in the field. And we need to be elevating those practices. And I do think that sometimes we struggle with how to bring that work to light and to the surface. And I think that's something that we can do a better job of. I'll also add that I think that the importance of having data and evidence-informed decision-making relates a lot to some of the social emotional development of students, because when you are a student, you have a lot more agency to lead your learning when you understand where you have strengths, where you have areas for growth, and by having the knowledge of where you are at specifically, and where you need to kind of lead your learning and ask your teacher for more support and assistance so that you guys can work in partnership and build that relationship around growth and accelerating learning. To me, that's the power also of using evidence to inform instruction. It's not just about what the teacher has, but about transferring that knowledge to students. And that can happen honestly, at all ages. I've seen kindergarten students have agency over their learning and be engaged and active participants in leading their learning. And so that's, I think, the vision where I have seen this executive leadership team and this board moving towards, I think. And to me, that's very powerful and very exciting. And I know our current performance may not reflect that yet, but I do think that that is the road that I see us on. I hope you all see us on that road as well. But it's an exciting road.
So one of the things that we highlight, please, I want to just.
I wanted to highlight that, one, I appreciate the high standards that you spoke of, Dr. Green. I think that it's important for us to have high expectations because we ourselves and children cannot meet standards and expectations that aren't there. And I think that's part of our investment in their aptitude is to have high expectations for what they can accomplish. And I guess the other thing I want to add is that I can see the value in including students in the conversation about their growth. I think it's really important that we keep in mind, though, that students be engaged with their growth in trusted relationships where expectations are high, because that information could also be used in a way that's discouraging. And so there has to be the proper relationship and the proper context there in order to have ownership over one's growth. You need to be an environment where, one, you're getting what you need in order to make the growth that you're seeking to make, but also where someone believes that you can do it. And they communicate and talk to you and your family in a way that indicates that they believe that it can be done and that you can do it. And I think outside of that context, we have problems, right, in how data is used.
Yeah, I would completely agree that the creation of that learning climate is paramount to the success of whatever focus is around academic data or performance. Totally agree with that. One thing I would add, that in our next steps to your question about what are we focusing in on and how do we do less, we sometimes hear we need to focus on one thing. And what I would say is that what's emerged at the cabinet level, and really we've been starting to really talk with our teachers and with principals about, is really tightening our laser-like focus on the standards, right? So the Illinois standards and the Common Core state standards, and thinking about how that greater attention of raising our bar for really understanding what is quality instruction, what is the impacts of the shifts of the Common Core on our curriculum. Now, many of these things, I would argue, have been embedded in various ways into our curriculum. However, the need for greater attention for our learning as leaders, our staff, for everybody to be engaged in that is really what we've identified in terms of our competencies, and really thinking about tightening that for really getting closer. So that's something that's coming forward soon, but we put it in here as, if you were to say what's our priority, is we have to do that, and that will help us then use formative assessment much more effectively. The more we can understand what are the shifts and what are the requirements for the learning, we can then use formative assessment much more productively. So you can have all the formative assessment in the world, but if we're not thinking about the required instruction and the quality of instruction that's there, we're not going to be able to leverage the learning that's happening there. So that's one of our recognition, and thanks to Dr. Green and her work, she's been able to really bring those questions and push us to really think more productively about the need for that. And it's been a huge, she's been a great thought partner to all of us in helping us get a lot more attentive and attuned to that need across the cabinet. And I think it will really leverage the need particularly for Black students in this district, and it's complementary as well to the culturally relevant practices that are emerging. But without that attention to standards, it puts us in a deficit position.
I would just say, I think that, so I appreciate, the emphasis on the data. I think just better communicating with the community what it is that we're doing. In the case of the King Lab, I think if that community had been better prepared and knew what was coming, I think we could have alleviated ourselves a lot of drama and unnecessary, possibly stress as a community, to know that there is a reason for that. I want to thank you for starting the conversation and making parents partners. I think one of the most powerful things that you've done in your work this year is really present the data to parents and help parents understand what these scores mean. I definitely agree that students can be their best advocates as age appropriate as possible, especially as we work towards ensuring that our 8th graders, our 7th and 8th graders, or all middle schoolers, know how to take advantage of what's being offered at the high school. So I think that that's a really powerful start to making parents partners, and I think I look forward to more of that next year, because I think that the very start of parent-teacher conferences, that that one handout, it was alarming, but sometimes you got to alarm people to say you need to be paying attention to this. And I think part of the community's apprehensiveness about standardized tests is just a lack of understanding and what that means, and I think how we can best support our students and what that means also, I think, to teachers. So I think it was probably a big awakening to teachers and what they could be doing better. So I wanted to thank you for that, and I look forward to next year, really creating partnerships with parents and with students.
Let me say, in response to that, Rebecca, that it's well known that this is challenging work. difficult in ways that, are only compacted or compounded by what happens in our buildings and what's happening in society at large, right? So I think that, having objective measures while we are working on our implicit bias and while we are working on our own understanding of the role of whiteness in all of us is an equalizer. So part of what I want to describe is that there is technical work to being a teacher, and then there's the heart and mind work, right? And so we've kind of got both things going on. We've got people really examining who they are as racial beings while we're charged with the challenge of what happens when a kid isn't getting what I've presented. And so while I wouldn't necessarily say that the standards work isn't present within our curriculum and in our work, I think that there is definitely a deepening of what it means for high expectations and cognitive rigor when it doesn't show up as traditionally as you might expect it. And I think that that is a learning shift for adults as well. And I also think that we have to be mindful in how we manage that learning too. And so the communication to parents and to the board and cabinet at large is this is really, really not just hard, arduous work that we're stepping into. It's challenging people at their core. It is hard to build the kind of mindset that you elect to teach in a program like the ACC and expect that belief system to permeate every classroom. There's basically some absolute obstacles that we face as a large community around standards and instructional practices and what equity essentially means, right? I think that the notion of giving people their equal share is one we all celebrate. I'm not sure if people are registering that it requires hard decisions about what to remove, because we're also in constraints of these are the finite resources we have. I'm not quite sure that we're all on the same page about that. And so that is probably the next frontier of this discussion is equity is what we believe in until it impacts my household and until it impacts my child's programming choices. And I just think that's real talk. And I'm grateful for opportunities like this. Anya, you said something earlier about just acknowledging an anti-Black, sentiment around why people aren't choosing Oakton, considering the good news that we hear and share. But it's very real that it isn't as attractive a programming spot because it is largely centered in a school that is predominantly Black. And that's just real. And I will say, from having been a principal in this community, my challenge in making adjustments and shifts last year to help move an organization in a direction that I thought wanted to see what equity looked and could feel like. It happens at the expense of adults feeling comfortable. And I don't think people, we ain't okay always saying that the discomfort that is caused for adults sometimes is absolutely what's in the best interest of children and all children. And I just think that those kind of courageous conversations that we have to have makes it possible for parents to be informed about what the data, all of my colleagues knew that one pager was going out to say, look, this is shining a light on some things that we might not be doing well. And I think the beauty of what we attempt to do is say, here are the problems, how do we solve them? I think trying to move away from admiring them and patting ourselves on the back for the steps that we have made. Well, now it's time to really tighten up our belts a little bit more, because it absolutely is going to be a bumpy ride, and I do not yet feel that we are all on the same page on what that ride looks like, and that's inclusive of in this room and community-wise as well.
I appreciate the honesty about the challenges that we're facing. And I also appreciate you, Rebecca, calling out what many families have expressed, which is, okay, so now what, right? So we see this information. What is the urgent and strategic and responsive plan to address this before the end of the year, right? So when we see the data like we saw at King Arts, and when we see this disaggregated data by school, by grade level, with really low metrics of college and career readiness, there's a sense of urgency, right? And a lot of that urgency is looking ahead. Okay, if this is where my baby is, right? So where is my baby gonna be in a year, 3 years from now? Is my baby gonna be at the high school struggling to read in 9th grade? Like, what is our future going to look like for these children that we love? And I guess what I would like to see is, and I'm hearing that push that we need to have we need to have some priorities. We need to be honest about the limitations. I'm looking for that proposal, right? So how are what resources are we deploying where? When are they being deployed? What is the impact of that? What's the cost? Do we need more? Do we have enough? Do we not have enough? I think we need to have those conversations, and it needs to be very concrete. I think for every parent that saw their child in that King Arts data, that was heartbreaking. That's a trauma. That's a trauma to that parent. That's a trauma to those children. What is the solve that we can give? This is what we have this expertise in-house, and this is what we're doing. We see you, we know what's going on, and we're going to address it. Like that's what I was hoping to hear more about. And I'm sorry, I'm on the wrong memo. I'm gonna go back to this other one. I saw the mid-year data review actions, and I also was at the King Arts Town Hall, and at the King Arts Town Hall, MTSS was mentioned, but it was like we're just now looking at the data. We're just now looking at MTSS in February, which didn't feel like a terribly urgent response to alarming data. So we have tools at our disposal. How are they being deployed? When are they being deployed? What do we need more of, less of, in order to deploy the tools that we have to address the urgent needs that we clearly have?
Not rhetorical, was it?
That was not rhetorical. Thanks for your clarifying question.
We're doing a couple of things at the cabinet level. One, and again, this gets at the data that we have and the tools that we have as you put forward. We are looking, as we set goals and priorities for next year, to be keenly focused on what Latarsha was specifically saying, which is that we have to be teaching towards grade level expectations. Those grade level expectations have to be at the highest level, and all kids have to have access to them. And these data actually tell us that all kids don't. And so we've got to turn around our practices. So one piece is around instructional practices, and that's as soon as, and this may not be soon enough, so this is actually an important debate. That's as soon as, how do we turn to the school improvement teams that are working on setting goals for the year to come, and to think about how do we focus on that. That doesn't answer the, what do we do in February. When the data came out, when did the data come out, the formative data? About February. So, right, so the formative data come out in about February, and then we have to sort of gig them up into the MTSS engine, and then to be able to use them in a proactive way. Again, I'm not sure if that directly answers the mom or the dad who's really worried about their baby right at that moment. But what it does is it creates for us a structure by which our professionals can actually look at what they're doing and make some changes in the interim. And so it's the interim piece is to really activate the MTSS system and to use the data to drive the types of discussions that go on in staff meetings and grade level meetings to make a difference. The longer term piece is around school improvement planning and really, as Andalip was saying, getting us to a point where we're really embracing even more so than we have in the past, the standards at the highest level of expectations. Other thoughts?
I mean, somewhat practically, we also, we got to clear the bandwidth to do this work. We have to be in buildings, we have to be supporting principals, we have to be eyes and guides on the side. We have to know that we are marching to the same sound as a board and as a cabinet team. Because Candace, something that I think that you put, like, it's the nail, hitting the nail on the head, is around kind of being in and out where we view the work of looking at data. It is not the end all be all, but it is information. And we need to become much more savvy at using information to be strategic. Accountability is another word that we have to stop weaponizing and taking the fear factor away from it, but empowering us to do what is in the best interest of children. So these are not, you know, new inventions, but they do require a courageous leadership and a focus, a laser-like focus. And currently, we have a lot of competing priorities. And I know that we are doing some work at the cabinet level to really synchronize some of our efforts so that we are marching in the same direction with respect to 18 different sites and their different needs as well. So there's not one exact science or way to do this, but literally the roadmap is within the opportunity myth, right? So how do we do that while changing hearts and minds, while allowing people to grapple with their own racial identities, while believing or not believing that they have a responsibility or a collective ownership of results, right? That it's not any one person's fault, but it's all of our fault if our kids aren't achieving. Those are the harder things. So we can absolutely deploy resources and reallocate things, which is, I don't think it's off the table to do because you have to look at doing something different, but we all know that that's a firestorm too. And are we all prepared to address that firestorm when it comes?
I guess what I'm trying to say is I think we are prepared. We need the proposal to support, right? Like, we as a board cannot propose how to deploy the resource. And I don't think that we're not supposed to, but I also don't think we do it well. Like, I think that definitely should come from you all, and I think that it's our job as public servants to stand tall on what we believe is right based on all of the information that we have, both from our community and our institution.
So I would just say that absolutely. So one of the things that we clarified in here was that we have to routinize, develop much tighter systems around that urgency that needs to happen for our principals, our teachers, actually for all individuals in the system when the data drops, right? And so that's already led to a change in terms of developing a professional learning calendar for next year that's going to be significantly better coordinated. It's still, this will be a first year in a long time where that process has required everybody to come to the table. I would say that the data dropping in December, and then the analysis and the reflection has accelerated that, so that the urgency to do that means that we have to work tighter. Educational systems are wrought with everybody works with their lane. That has to change. That cannot continue, and I will say that I'm not saying we're there yet, but as a result of the mid-year data, that formative assessment has forced us, even the way in which our school work plans are coordinated in relation to the school district's plans. Historically, the district, and as a principal for 6 years, and then in my role now, historically the district would provide its goals and its priorities probably around July. As a principal, I'd already developed my plans for the year with my team, and so then that meant that all the work my team had put in, we had to backtrack and try to figure out how we were going to integrate the district's plans. We're working to change that for this very reason, so that there's a rhythm, and it's a really clear rhythm, and I use that word not in a loose way, but that in a much more concrete way, that there's significantly better coherence around what teachers are expected to do in relation to what their school goals are, and in relation to, most importantly, what the district has identified systemically. The assessment calendar is a big part of that. I would say that the practices are related to what's in the assessment calendar were coordinated with MTSS plans this year. However, again, you're facing schools where a principal or a school improvement team, a school climate team are having to choose between. We have significantly evident biases now, to your question about what principals and what teachers are recognizing in themselves. So we've got to invest time in that. At the same time, they have to turn around and work on how they're addressing the high important instructional needs, right? So how do we do the sense making for our principals as a district cabinet? We are recognizing that we have to tighten our systems, and I own that. Improving that correlation between equity and student achievement, those aren't separate goals. And the fact that we struggle with that sometimes, not that we recognize that changing the outcomes for instruction are correlated to bias. However, that means that we have to do that better. And I would say that that is something that also means that I don't work on an island by myself as the supporter of principals. I have to work tightly with my colleagues, and then we have to come up with shared goals and plans that are really interdependent. And I think Dr. Gorin has really pushed us to do that in a much more intentional way than has been forced on us in the past.
And I got to tell you, I think that's, pushing back on what is it that we have to shed, I think it's more of how we can collaborate and be cohesive in regards to how we move forward with the vision that the board has around equity. Again, for me, I'm all for actionable data. As a matter of fact, the parents at King Arts acted on the data that they were given, and now they're forcing us to change. And they are asking for specific things. They want some supports for their kids. They want reading specialists. They want social workers. At the end of the day, we keep on going back to this data, and it actually, for me, it perpetuates some of this inequity and the vision, the way we view black and brown children as not enough. I mean, and I've had enough of that. I really have had enough of that. I get it that we need the data. As a teacher, I relied on it. If I could get actionable data, then I would change my instruction to meet my kids' needs where they need it. But I still, the data would also tell me that they also needed social workers, that they also need maybe need a psychologist. They need that mom and dad need a job, so they need job training. So those are the things that again, there's things that we can control as a school in regards to instruction and whatever supports we can give. But there's also another way to be cohesive with other institutions. So the City of Evanston, right? Working with their mental health, commission, working with YWCA for support on domestic abuse. So there's these issues that again we continue doing isolated work and perpetuating the inequity because we are failing to address the issues that this data keeps on telling us over and over and over again. And what this data keeps telling us is that those who have access to the time, who have the money, and who have access to opportunities are the ones who are going to do really great on tests. And everybody else, get to 40 or 50% if we're lucky, if we really focus like a laser on reading and reading and math scores, which again, in and of itself is very limiting. So again, some of my questions for today are like, instead of what are we going to pull away? I think we're working on the right things. Is how can we work cohesively within, as a board, as an administration, and with partner institutions, right? And be cohesive and move forward to provide opportunities and the supports that families and students need to get them where they need to be and to those high expectations that we want for all our kids. And I think some of the promising things that we've done, again, as a board, is that we have detracked algebra, right? And I want to go after geometry too, because apparently that's a thing as well. Where kids are accelerated. I want that for black and brown kids. So what do we do? How do we move forward? So I agree with Anya. It's like, okay, well, I'm glad that we're doing all these things, that we're going to focus and we're going to get everybody focused on how to utilize the data and act on it in the right way and provide those instructional supports. But for me, there's these larger issues that I think we need to have an honest conversation on how we can reach out to connections with the homeless around homelessness. Like, again, there's these entities that, again, are doing these things in isolation, but we're not really bringing in to support these families because, again, and going back to that ACC conversation, right, those kids are doing, given the issues and the traumas and the obstacles that and how they've been marginalized, these students are doing absolutely incredible. Now, in a map, now if we were to put it in a graph, they're not doing so great. But they're actually doing incredible. And even TWE students, right, who are learning another language. You have parents who don't have the time a lot of times to be able to work with their kids, to do homework with them, who don't have the money to put them in summer camps and enrichment activities. So that's what's upsetting to me is that, again, if we get the test scores and the kids are doing all right, I'm not happy with that. We need a much more broader view of children, a much more inclusive view, a much more holistic view. So then for me.
To what end, Sergio? Like what, if we have those metrics, to what end? Is it satisfying us to ensure that to what end
Well, we already have the metrics, I think. I think the metrics can help us get to see. So I would like to have a metric where we're measuring who has access to these opportunities that are out there and who doesn't. And then if they don't, let's get them the supports that they need.
Can I ask a question? One of the access points is instruction, and is high quality instruction, and is high grade level expectations, so that we are not just saying one type of kid, one class of kid gets the high expectations, and the rest of the kids get something else. So there is a piece. I'm not adverse to what you're saying. I actually embrace it in terms of the broad community partnerships that we have. But we are responsible for instruction in the classroom, and I don't think all of our kids are getting the level of instruction that they should get to be able to succeed. And that's where, if you take the Banbrick book that we've been using as a driver, and you look at that story that we embedded in the memo, there's remarkable progress on these crappy indicators, if you want to call them that, but they're remarkable progress. And the progress is what we have to do while we're doing the community partnership work as well.
So I just challenge the notion, though, and I think we all should consider this, of that it's an all or nothing, that it's standardized tests and nothing else, and that's the only thing we can focus on. And I agree we have to focus on them because, like you said, Dr. Green, this is the reality of the world we live in. Kids aren't going to get into Harvard without standardized test scores. But it doesn't have to be just that and nothing else. I mean, we have invested a lot as a district in social and emotional learning because we believe that that is a lever to get kids to perform better on these standardized tests. Because we believe that that is ultimately what makes children successful and learners and lifelong learners. And yet, we reduce them to a test score. So I think it's not an all or nothing. I think it's, as we are continuing to work in this white supremacist system that says we have to do these standardized tests, which, by the way, we know are inherently racist, that while we have to continue with that system because it's a system we live in, why can't we also create some sort of more holistic metric of what our students bring to the table so that we can provide another narrative? And to what end? I think it's to, so students know that they are more than just, especially frankly in these cases, more than just a deficient test score. so the families know that their students have things that can be celebrated, so that our community knows that Black and brown students are not just the low end of the achievement gap. I think those are valuable things. I think that's why we have invested in school climate teams and in this kind of holistic look of what is important for children. And so while I would never suggest that we abandon standardized tests in its entirety, I think, of course, we have to maintain high standards. We have to make sure that we are getting kids to where they need to be on those tests. But I don't think that it's at the expense of all the other work that we are doing. I think it's all part and parcel, and I think we need some way to make sure that we know that we're doing that work successfully and that kids can feel successful and belonging, and that's a really important part of their academic success.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that I think social and emotional measures are measure of the reduction of hostility that some children and families have felt in our schools, not feeling welcome, not feeling represented, not feeling uplifted, invested in, expected of. And we don't have a very consistent metric of what the impact of that is. And I think if we look at social and emotional experiences, if we did provide some kind of survey measure, that would help us to see more of what is the experience that children and families are having that creates barriers to being able to reach those achievement expectations that we have. And I also don't think it's an and or. I think it's a both and I think it's a misnomer, a myth, that those things have to be oppositional. I absolutely value my children's academic and social and emotional development.
I would agree, but my other comment was around bandwidth, right? So to what extent do we say there's too much testing going on, not enough time for instruction, but we offer other assessments? So more so my comment was around what do we value as a community of decision makers and what are we willing to stand behind? Because in order to, I absolutely agree. I'm not saying it's one or the other. I'm speaking to the already stretched limits that our educators are currently working under. And so what is it that is what's our stake in the ground,
but
right?
I will say our educators are asking for social emotional measures. They are investing in this work too, and they want to know how it's being implemented and how it's being successful. So yeah, I think we do a lot of different academic standardized testing, and I do think we need to have a discussion. And we do a lot of it, when you look at the calendar, we do a lot of it in early grades when we're supposed to be working on relationship building. So I do think we need to have that conversation. I think we need to figure out what can we take off the plate and how can we, again, I will just go back to, we made a decision with the strategic plan that we implemented 4 years ago to focus more holistically on children and to implement social and emotional learning. A couple of years ago, we put in a social emotional learning course in our elementary schools. We have to have some way to assess how that work is going. We have to know, is that impacting how children are experiencing school, how they feel about themselves as learners? Otherwise, I'm not sure.
I agree with you, Suni. I'm just wondering where in the day this happens.
So, yeah, and just one of the things we did do this year is we have piloted a social emotional learning assessment linked in our social emotional and equity learning classes in kindergarten, first and fourth. We're still at the point where we want to close out the pilot and really evaluate what we've learned from this tool and whether this is the right tool. But this was a step for us to take a look at whether we could find an appropriate measure to measure the impact of that particular course. We did keep it within the SEAL course this year in order to be able to assess the tool and see if it has some validity and value as a tool within this course and then across space for other educators. And we did that largely to try to minimize the initial impact of an assessment. We want to be able to get a feel for that. So we are doing some work in that space to try to determine the impact of this work and then the ways in which that information might be able to be used to better lift up our students and to better meet our students' needs. We are also engaged in this conversation around trying to refine the assessment calendar and make revisions, and that is a collaborative conversation that we're having. And all of these do need to come together in a space. At the end of the goal is to be able to get a better balance around assessment time, still getting the necessary academic information, while also looking at more measures. And that's going to be tough because we need to watch out for the impact on learning time while trying to figure out which pieces of information are going to be most valuable. But we do have this pilot that we're looking at. We're hopeful to be able to kind of get a sense of whether this is the right tool in the right direction before we close out the school year.
I think
Okay,
in terms of bandwidth, Dr. Green, I think this board has welcomed to hear from administration what things we need to give up in order to do this work and do it well. So again, I would welcome that feedback from the administration. What do we need to give up to do this work and do it well? I read an article in Ed Weekly where they compare schools to hospitals, right? So if we were a hospital, would we be graded by the patients we make well, or would we be graded by the sick people we make well? You know, and that really resonated with me because if we were a hospital, I would hope we would get graded by the number of patients we make well. And so now we have a chart of health that is a score. And so I would love to see, you know, perhaps not for our 8th graders, but for our, you know, our 3rd grade through 6th graders, that we have a chart of health going into next year. What in the school plan, what in the work that we're committing to in the incoming year for our kids that are not well, how do we get them to health? Because our kids that are doing well are going to continue doing well, and I think that our measure should be a measure of our kids who need it the most. And I really hope that going into next year, we can work with our administrators to look at our children as patients. You know, all of our kids deserve to be well. And how do we take that approach, and how do we challenge ourselves to take those charts of health and get those scores to a healthy level? And again, you know, in terms of bandwidth, yes, we can't do everything for everybody, but we have kids that are counting on us for their wellness. And so whatever, you know, bandwidth items that you need to present to us, I would welcome that. And I would welcome hearing how those school plans start this summer and how we're working towards starting fall up and running and working on the wellness of our students.
If I could add one thing just to that, I mean, one point to think about, because we do talk about MTSS a lot, is, and, you know, we're whatever, 48% or 52, I wasn't here for the presentation, but we're not at 100% of where we need to. The goal was 75% by the end of the year. What would it take in terms of resources, time? Would it be possible for over the summer? Because we know going into next year, the kids that needed plans this year are likely going to need plans beginning next year. How do we get a head start, or what would it take for us to have our, you know, MTSS plans for 100% of the kids by the fall? Or is that plausible? What resources would that take? I'm just asking a specific piece, not because I think that's an important one, but also because just to point to the kinds of things that we're talking about. Like, is that a point of leverage enough that if there would be a way to invest resources in having that, so we don't have a startup process again in the fall? Because at this point, I know us saying, like, putting a stake in the ground and saying 100% by the end of the year is like 4 weeks. Like, what are we gonna, that doesn't matter. We have a plan, but then can we implement it?
Old plans travel with kids, right?
Yes, so that, and that is one of the powers of, you know, so we moved to this tool this year, and that means we started at 0. And so plans will follow students going into next year. part of our conversation, and we have yet to finalize this, is a conversation about what fall assessment will look like next year, and will we rely more heavily on spring assessment and the information that travels from the previous year? And if that's the case, there's the thinking and idea would be to create some space and time to take a look at those plans, take a look at your spring data, and really then also sit down and engage with that child to get a sense of, now does that information still feel accurate for that child for me to begin my teaching? Because what we do know is in our younger grades that, and I'm not a big fan of the term summer learning loss, because I think once a kid learns it, it's there, but it's our job to reactivate it and get them going again and make them reconnect to that learning. We know that we have more work to do to reconnect to that learning to get them jump-started. So I'm getting long-winded on your plan, but your comment. So 75%, your idea. The reason we say 75% as opposed to 100 is there are students that already have plans in place, students with IEPs and ELs. And so that's why we aim there. We can roll plans over from this year, but we need to create time and space for our educators to get to know that data, get to know the plans, and get to know the kids to make sure that they make any refinements to the plans that are needed to be doing right and meaningful work for kids. And so we need to look at that opportunity as we return and with some of our time early in the year to make sure that we have a faster on-ramp for the work with our kids. And I think that's something that's doable. I'm not sure I know the number that would be appropriate yet, but creating the space for them to know the spring data and know the plans and begin to work in a very meaningful way is possible based on the fact that we're staying in the same tool, and that lifting up will be a much smaller process because there will be a familiarity with the tool and the kids' data will be in the tool.
And maybe that's
Can
a
I-
triage piece at King Arts, or, I mean, to your point about
It's a
hospitals,
good-
we have
so-
triage and then we
so-
have.
And what you raised there is a good question, is are we more targeted in the support at particular schools?
Yes.
To make sure that that happens faster in certain places. That in itself is, I think, probably a better strategy because again, it's not wide and light, it would be going deeper. So
And that's a
an
key
issue.
point about targeting, because I think at some point, we're going to have to say, we need to invest here. And it doesn't mean we're not going to invest in other children who are trying to succeed, but if our kids are really struggling, we've got to put the resources to help them do better.
And auditing, just because we have plans created, doesn't mean we have them fully executed.
Right.
or
Correct,
quality.
correct.
Well, and that's why I talk about getting to know the
Right.
kids and the plan.
So a principal saying, look, I can't execute here because of X versus Y, like, where do we need it? Right? Fair doesn't mean equal.
Plan is not necessarily, is not solely the answer.
Fair doesn't mean equal.
Yeah, so I agree with that. I definitely want to echo the sentiment that we welcome hearing from you all in terms of where we need to lean in, where we need to pull back, in the form of a proposal so that we can give you kind of that go-ahead and that green light. And I also wanted to add that one of the things I think was revealed by the King Arts conversation that we've been having in our community is the need for communication with families. So there were some families at King Arts who had students who were on the honor roll, but then we're told that their students were not reading at grade level or doing math at grade level. That adds to the trauma. If you think that you're well, right, and then someone says, no, you actually had a heart attack, you're not well, that's shocking, that's frightening, right? And that also requires some urgent response that's different than perhaps what you were already doing. And we also heard from Donna that the MTSS system has parent reports. So if we have a system that can provide communication, what is the expectation in terms of how that information gets in the hands of the folks who vitally need it in order to make changes perhaps to what they're doing with their time and energy, or the expectations that they have within their household or within their child's classroom. Our parents, our partners, they have hopes and dreams and high expectations for their children. And they are entrusting one of the most sacred relationships in their lives to us. They're sharing their children with us. They should get adequate information and accurate information on the health of their child's learning, and not find out that their child is on the honor roll but also is struggling with reading. I would hope that whatever we get in terms of a plan has carved out what is the necessary time or resource in order to adequately communicate with parents as well.
And I also want to add to that again, that we want to look out through the whole continuum, right, in those transitions. So when we look at, that transition from pre-K to kindergarten, when we look at the transition from, fifth grade to sixth, to middle school, I think those are, as you look at this information, as we look at our assessment battery and schedule, we really think about those times and making sure that, because again, what we see is that kids will be doing good at the end of pre-K, but then they're not reading really well in kindergarten and in first grade, second grade. I talked to parents who were told in middle school that their kid is doing great, and they get to the high school, they do the STAR assessment, their STAR screener, because it's a screener, right? Our diagnostic tool, and they're doing remedial reading. So again, how do we also align throughout the continuum, and specifically in those transition areas that are really, really tough, or where we really see issues that pop up for Black and brown families. I think that's something that really we should definitely be exploring as well.
So just this morning, we had a meeting of the senior management team, and we were talking about two sort of umbrella goals for the year to come. One is around prioritizing student success and reaching grade level expectations and doing this instructional work. And the second one, and I appreciate what you just said, Anya, is around communication and around organizational communication that's clear, concise, timely, immediate, long run, and so we're working as a team on that, and then that's going to actually help us set the priorities that will then lead to the plan that we would bring forward based on priorities and based on where we want to put some resource and budget. And we've been talking a lot about, the alignment, the assessment question, and Anya and Suni are actively involved in this with Stacy and me and Andalib and our union colleagues, and really looking at the assessment calendar and trying to make what are tough decisions on what we'll do and what we won't do. And again, we're still squeezed in this world because the state assessment is the state assessment and the MAP assessment, and we're offering both, and we've got a long history of data in the MAP database, and so to move away from that without actually doing the alignment work will leave us in situations that we don't want to be left in. So we've got that work to do as well.
All right, well, thank you all for the conversation. I think it's clear we all feel very passionately about and engaged about how we get success for our students, particularly our marginalized students. So thank you for the discussion. I adjourn this meeting at 11:01. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.